What's going on, guys? This has changed my mind. First episode here, bringing you guys some information that you can look at for yourselves and then maybe go get some more information, send it my way, whatever. Gonna go ahead and start first week off with the topic of the Federal Reserve, otherwise known as the private bank that is, the people that make our money. I'm sure if you have any money on you, you can pull it out and read it. It says Federal Reserve Notes. Those are the independent private bankers that make our money out of nothing and cause you to be so fucking broke and all that jazz, because it's literally backed by nothing and causes inflation by printing it. So we're going to get into that history a little bit, show you basically start to finish where the idea came from, how it's happened, where it's happened, all that. You guys can kind of read between the lines and kind of make sense of it for yourself. Sources will be provided, all that good shit. But it's a fun topic for sure. So first off, the Federal Reserve, there's nothing federal about it. And there are no reserves. The name is a deception, and it was created back in 1913. They used that name as a deception to try and make Americans think that America's central bank operates in the public interest, but in reality, the Federal Reserve is a private bank owned by private stockholders, and it's run purely for their profit. If you don't believe me, you can check your local telephone book. As in most cities, the Federal Reserve is not listed in the blue government pages. It's in the business white pages right next to Federal Express, which is another private company. There's nothing federal about it. It's just a name to deceive you. But nonetheless, more directly, the United States courts have ruled time and again that the Federal Reserve is a private corporation. Like whenever they've gotten in trouble in years past, all the courts have always ruled that it is a private corporation because that's what it is. So that's how it's been treated in court cases in the past. So in 1923, Representative Charles A. Lindbergh, a Republican from Minnesota and the father of the famed aviator Lucky Lindy, put it this way, saying, quote, "The financial system has been turned over to the Federal Reserve Board. That board administers the finance system by the authority of a purely profiteering group. The group is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money." So you'll hear later kind of who Charles A. Lindbergh was. He was one of the guys that was, at least in the early 1900s, he was one of the premier fighters of the money changers, which is a term that we'll kind of learn later that is just a word to say the people controlling the printing of the money. But yeah, this is nothing new, so let's keep moving. Former chairman of the House of Banking and Currency Committee during the Great Depression years in 1932, Louis T. McFadden, this is another great guy, he quoted saying, "In our country, one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board. This evil institution has impoverished the people of the United States and has practically bankrupted the government. It has done this through the corrupt practices of the money vultures who control it." So, money changers, money vultures, private bankers, you call it what you want. It's going to make more sense as we keep going, but these are just some opening quotes by some guys that have fought it. But we're getting a phone call now. Let's take a quick break. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. Family calls, Yeah, these money vultures, let's keep going and learning about these peeps. As Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater said, quote, "Most Americans have no real understanding of the operation of the international money lenders. The accounts of the Federal Reserve System has never been audited. It operates outside the control of Congress and manipulates the credit of the United States." So that's Senator kind of just telling you, yeah, these guys don't play by the rules and they're outside of everything and no one's ever made them be honest with an audit. So God only knows what they're up to. Moving on. Even though the Federal Reserve isn't part of the federal government, it is more powerful than the federal government, and it's more powerful than the President of the United States and the Congress and all the courts. And, a lot of people will challenge that. However, the Federal Reserve determines what the average person's car payment will be, what their house payment is going to be, and whether or not they have a job. So I submit to you that that's total control. Federal Reserve is the largest single creditor of the United States government. We owe them all the money, and they're private. And, what does Proverbs tell us? The borrower is servant to the lender. So yeah, what a thing to be in control of. From the day the Constitution was adopted right up to today, the people who profit from privately owned central banks, as President Madison called them, the money changers, they've fought for a running battle basically over the control over who gets to print America's money. This is nothing new, and we're going to go through all that history. So first of all, why is it even important who prints the money? Why is that such a question, or why is that such an importance? Because money is basically a commodity. It is a commodity, and if you have a monopoly on a commodity that everyone needs and everyone wants and no one has enough of, then there's lots of ways to make a profit and also exert tremendous political influence. So that's what the battle's all about to this day. Throughout history of the United States, the money power has gone back and forth between Congress and some sort of privately owned central bank. and it's happened, I think, about 8 times, but we'll go through them. So the founding fathers, they knew the evil of privately owned central banks. First of all, they had seen how privately owned central banks, the Bank of England being theirs, they had run up the British national debt to such an extent that Parliament had been forced to place unfair taxes on the American colonies. And Ben Franklin stated that this was the cause of the American Revolution. So I know some of you kind of know this story, like the Boston Tea Party, but you're about to see it wasn't really about tea and tax. It was about the control of money, and that's what. The founding fathers, they knew this very well, but it seemed to have been forgotten now. Anyways, let's keep going. Most of the founding fathers, they realized that the potential dangers of banking, and they feared bankers' accumulation of power and wealth. So that American dream you think you got, it's kind of been taken out from under you, and they tell you still got it, but you don't. Thomas Jefferson put it this way, quote, "I sincerely believe the banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs." Good quote, Thomas Jefferson. James Madison, well, he was the main author of the Constitution, and he agreed with Thomas Jefferson, and he called the bankers money changers, and he strongly criticized their actions, being quoted saying, "History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance." The battle over who gets to issue our money has been the pivotal issue throughout the history of the United States. Wars have been fought over it, depressions are caused to acquire it, and yet after World War I, this battle has rarely been mentioned in newspapers or history books. I wonder why. Because by the end of World War I, the money changers, and with their dominant wealth, had seized most of every nation's press. They control it, and now they control all of it. But by the end of World War I, they controlled enough of it to paint the whitewash picture that they wanted. Not white like a religion whitewash, like look up the word and meaning, like using a biased presentation of data to create a perception and or agenda, and that's exactly what's happened. But nonetheless, throughout U.S. history, the battle over who gets the power to issue money has changed hands, 8 times since 1764, and this is a fact that's virtually vanished from public view for over 3 generations behind a smokescreen emitted by Fed cheerleaders. Until we stop talking about deficits and government spending and start talking about who controls how much money we have, it's all just a shell game, a complete and utter deception. We have to take back the power of issuing our own money, and this is the same solution that was used throughout the history of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, and Abraham Lincoln. They all knew this. And to sum it up, in 1913, Congress gave an independent central bank that was deceptively named the Federal Reserve a monopoly over the issuing of America's money. And the debt generated by this private corporation is what's killing the American economy. Although the Federal Reserve is now the most powerful central bank in the world, it was not first. And, to understand where it came from, it's just a matter of looking at history, and that's what we're here to do. Money changers are nothing new. 2,000 years ago, Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple, and it was the only time he ever used force in his ministry. It's the question of, what were the money changers doing in the temple? And the answer is that when the Jews came to Jerusalem to pay their temple tax, they could only pay it with a special coin, which was the half shekel of the sanctuary. And it was a half ounce of pure silver that was of assured weight, and it was the only coin at the time without the image of a pagan emperor. So for those Jews, it was a big deal, and therefore it was the only coin acceptable to God. So these coins were not plentiful because the money changers had cornered the market on them, and they raised the price just like any other commodity to whatever the market would bear. And in other words, they were making exorbitant profits over the money, and they held a virtual monopoly. The Jews had to pay whatever they demanded, and to Jesus, this totally violated the sanctity of God's house. But by then, the money-changing scam was not even original there. This even before Jesus' day, 200 years before Christ, Rome had the same exact problem in the Roman Empire with money changers. So, if you don't believe in Jesus or whatever, that's fine. I really don't care. You can believe what you want, but, Rome and the Roman Empire, if you don't believe in that, there's more evidence that it exists than you or me both. So 2 early Roman emperors, they tried to diminish the power of money changers by reforming usury laws, and they wanted to limit land ownership to 500 acres. They were both assassinated. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar took back the power to coin money from the money changers, and he minted coins for the benefit of all. And with it, the money supply was plentiful, and he had admiration by the common man. He was a very popular. There was public works. He had the love of the common man. The money chasers hated him, but most people believed it was, an important factor in Caesar's assassination ultimately. But one thing is for sure, that with the death of Caesar became the demise of plentiful money in Rome. And as taxes increased, as did corruption. So Just in the case of America today, usury and debased coin became the rule, and eventually the Roman money supply was reduced by 90%. So as a result of this, the common people lost their lands and their homes, just as is about to happen in America. With the demise of plentiful money, the masses lost confidence in the Roman government and refused to support it, and Rome plunged into the Dark Ages. So they literally took like nine out of $10 out of the economy. The people that controlled the money took all the money out of the economy. It sent them into the Dark Ages, and it was all for the profit of the people creating the money. So yeah, that's how it ends, and it ends like that every time, and it's about to again in America. Surprise! 1,000 years after the death of Christ, money changers, those who loan out money and manipulate the quantity of money, they were also active in medieval England, and in fact, they were so active that acting together, they could manipulate the entire English economy. But they were not bankers. The money changers generally were the goldsmiths. These goldsmiths were the first bankers, and it was because they started keeping people's gold for safekeeping in their vaults. Simply because it was pretty unpopular to walk around with a bunch of heavy coins in your pocket. Anyone could hear you walking around and be like, oh, that's the perfect guy to rob, Mr. Saddlebag Pocket over there. But anyways, that being the case, paper money caught on, and it was merely a receipt for gold left at the goldsmiths at that time. So you would take your gold to the goldsmiths and drop it off, and they would give you paper that was a receipt for as much gold as you gave them. And it was just more convenient than carrying heavy gold and silver coins. But eventually the goldsmiths noticed that only a small fraction of the depositors ever came back and demanded their gold at any one time. So the goldsmiths started cheating the system, and they discovered that they could print way more money than they had at gold, and usually no one would ever be the wiser. They could then loan out this money at interest, and this was the birth of what we know now as fractional reserve lending or fractional reserve banking. And this is the practice of lending out many more times than what you have on assets on deposit, and otherwise it's known as fraud. If anyone else did it, it would be fraud, but the finance system gets to do it, and they call it fractional reserve lending or fractional reserve banking. So if $1,000 were deposited with them, they could loan out about $10,000 in paper money and draw interest on the payments, and no one would ever discover the deception. By this means, goldsmiths gradually accumulated more and more wealth, and they would use it to accumulate more and more gold. And today, the practice of loaning out more money than there are reserves is, again, this is known as fractional reserve banking or lending. Every bank in the United States is allowed to loan out at least 10 times more money than they actually have, and that's why they get rich charging at least, let's say 8% interest. Hypothetically, that's not really 8%, that's 80%, because again, they get to loan it out times 10 with interest. And that is why bank buildings are always the largest in town. And does this mean that all interest should be illegal? No, not at all. And, in the Middle Ages canon law, the Catholic Church forbade charging interest on loans. And the concept to them was that it taught the teachings of Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. And they taught that the purpose of money was to serve the members of society, to facilitate the exchange of goods needed to live a virtuous life. And that's a beautiful thing. However, interest in their belief hindered the purpose by putting an unnecessary burden on the use of money. In other words, interest was contrary to reason and justice. And reflecting church law in the Middle Ages, Europe forbade charging interest on loans and made it a crime called usury. As commerce grew and therefore opportunities for investment arose in the late Middle Ages, it came to be recognized that to loan out money had a cost for the lender, both in risk and in the loss of opportunity. So some charges were allowed, but not interest per se. However, all moralists, no matter what religion, condemn fraud. So oppression of the poor and injustice is clearly immoral. And as we see, fractional reserve lending is rooted in a fraud, results in widespread poverty, and reduces the value of everyone else's money. So not all interest is bad, but fractional reserve lending, you bet it. Considering, we'll say one more time, it's rooted in a fraud. It's what causes widespread poverty, and it reduces the value of everyone's money. The ancient goldsmiths discovered that the extra profits could be made by rowing the economy between easy and tight money. Basically, when they made money easier to borrow, the amount of money in circulation expanded and money was plentiful, and people would take out more loans to expand their businesses. Why wouldn't they? But then the money changers would tighten the money supply, and they would make loans more difficult to get. And due to this, just like what happens today, a certain percent of those people could not repay their loans, and they couldn't get any new loans to repay the old ones, so they would go bankrupt, and they'd sell their assets to the goldsmiths on pennies on the dollar. And still the same thing happens today. We just call this rowing of the economy up and down the business cycle, but they create it. It's their pendulum. Like Julius Caesar, King Henry I of England finally resolved to take back the money power away from the goldsmiths about 1100 AD. So now we're back on the history track. We talked about in 48 BC, Julius Caesar and how he had the love of the common man for making money plentiful. 2 guys before him wanted to have usury laws, and they got assassinated. And now we are to 1100 AD with King Henry I of England trying to take the money power away from the goldsmiths. Henry could have used anything as money. Money is whatever we decide, whatever's made legal. But in the past, there's been seashells, feathers, a lot of things in history have been used as money. But he created one of the most unusual systems of money in the world and in history. It's called the tally stick system. And this form of British money lasted 726 years. I guarantee you guys have probably never even heard of this kind of money, yet it lasted longer than, or was more successful and has lasted longer than any other type of money. So ironic you haven't heard of it, but I wonder why. The tally stick system was adopted to avoid the monetary manipulation of the goldsmiths, and interestingly, no other form of money has worked so well and for so long. The British Empire was built under this system of the tally stick, and tally stick succeeded because even though the money changers constantly attacked it, offering metal coin as a competition, it worked because it was good for the payment of taxes. But those coins never went out of circulation. They always fought, but for 726 years, it worked really well. So there's been times, it's not a lost cause, there's been times in history where reform has happened and they've changed the system, but that's what it takes, and we'll see as it goes on that you can't just pay off the debt, whatever, you have to reform the system. You got to get rid of the coach, not the quarterback. Anyways, the tally stick system and the wooden money, this went on until the 1500s when King Henry VIII relaxed the laws concerning usury. And the money changers wasted no time reasserting themselves. They quickly made gold and silver more plentiful for a few decades. And then when Queen Mary took the throne and tightened the usury laws again, the money changers renewed the hoarding of gold and silver coins, forcing the economy to plummet. So yeah, these guys just manipulate the market, and they know how to do it. And it's not one family, it's like the idea itself. When Queen Mary's sister, Queen Elizabeth, first took the throne, she was determined to regain the control over English money, and her solution was to issue gold and silver coins from the public treasury and take the control over the money supply away from the money changers. She wanted to not have it be a privately owned corporation and have it be, backed by the government and take that back. So although control over the money was not the only cause of the English Revolution, sound familiar? We're not even to the American Revolution. This was the cause of the English Revolution in 1642. Monetary policy played a major role. Financed by the money changers, Oliver Cromwell finally overthrew King Charles, purged the parliament, and put the king to death. The money changers were immediately allowed to consolidate their financial power, and the result was for the next 50 years, the money changers plunged Great Britain into a series of costly wars. They took over a square mile of property in the center of London, known as the City of London. This area today is still known as one of the 3 predominant financial centers of the world. Has not changed since 1642. So you're going to start to see how, although you can blame a family and they are guilty, it's the idea and this group of people that although the families change, it's since about the 1700s, late 1600s, mid 1600s, it has not much changed as far as the locations and the model. It's been the Bank of England model, and it has not changed, and we'll see that. But anyways, let's go, because we're not even on to the American part yet. This is just still in England. So to this day, we still have the City of London, and it's a square mile of property, and it's one of the 3 predominant financial centers of the world. And it was set up by the money changers after they overthrew the king and put him to death, and was like, hey, let's do 50 years of costly wars and wreck the economy of our own country because it'll be good for us and bad for them. Who cares? And that's what happened, and that's what they do. By the end of the 1600s, England was in financial ruin. 50 years of more or less continuous wars with France and Holland had exhausted her. How convenient. Frantic government officials met with the money changers to beg for the necessary loans to pursue their political purposes, but the price was high. The money changers, they wanted a government-sanctioned, privately owned bank which could issue money created out of nothing. It was to be the modern world's first privately owned central bank, the Bank of England. There you go. And although it was deceptively called the Bank of England to make the general population think it was a part of the government, it was not. Much like the Federal Reserve, much like any other private corporation, the Bank of England sold shares to get started. The investors, whose names were never revealed, were supposed to put up 1.25 million British pounds in gold to buy their shares in the bank. That was what was supposed to happen. But only 750,000 pounds were ever received, and despite that, the bank was duly chartered in 1694, and it started out in the business of loaning out several times of the money it supposedly had in reserves, all at interest. In exchange, the new bank would loan the British politicians as much money as they wanted, as long as they secured the debt by the direct taxation of the papal. So, yeah, we are the laughingstock of them, that they print money out of nothing,
give it to politicians to gain influence, and we pay for all of it through inflation and taxes. So the legalization of the Bank of England amounted to nothing less than the legal counterfeiting of a national currency for private gain. Good shit. Unfortunately, not. Nearly every nation now has a privately owned central bank, and it uses the Bank of England as a basic model because it's the same dudes. It's their model. Such is the power of these central banks that they soon take control over a nation's economy, and it soon amounts to nothing but a plutocracy ruled by the rich. We need central banks, but we don't need them in private hands, and that's just it. The central bank scam is really a hidden tax. The nation sells bonds to the central bank to pay for things it does not have the political will to raise taxes to pay for, but the bonds are purchased with money that the central bank creates out of nothing. So more money in circulation makes your money worth less, and the government gets rich, and they get as much money as they want, and the people pay for it in inflation. And the beauty of it is not 1 in 1,000 people can figure it out because it's hidden behind a bunch of complex-sounding economics gibberish like the business cycle, which is really just them rowing the economy, which they create. Look it up. With the formation of the Bank of England, the nation was soon awash of money, and prices throughout the country doubled. Massive loans were granted for just about any wild scheme. One venture proposed to drain the Red Sea to recover gold supposedly lost when the Egyptian army drowned pursuing Moses and the Israelites. You walk into a bank and tell them that's your gig, and if you walk out with money, that's a silly bank or a bad economy, man. Not bad like that you won't get the money, bad like they're playing you. Like it's like the loan shark. Like, yeah, we'll give you money, and then we're going to come back and take all your shit because we know you can't pay it back because we don't want you to pay it back. Like the word mortgage, like most people's house mortgage means till death. That house is not your asset. It's the bank's asset. Silly. Anyways. And the only reason you have that house is because they gave you the loan and you can't afford it. You're like, but they gave me the loan. I'll be okay. Well, no, they're going to call in that loan and you're going to lose it. And that's what happens. That's why the fucking market shits. But no one asks questions when the market's doing well, but it's the calm before the storm. Anyways, let's keep looking at history and we can keep on reading between these lines. In the time that all these people are getting insane loans because the Bank of England's nuts, this was around 1698 that the government debt grew from its initial $1.25 million to 16 million pounds. And naturally, taxes were increased and then increased again to pay for all that. So with this, the British money supply firmly in their grip, the British economy started to begin a roller coaster series of booms and depressions, which is exactly the thing a central bank claims it's determined to prevent. But that didn't happen. They multiplied their initial debt by 12 times and completely sent the economy into a roller coaster, which is, what they said they would never do. And that's what they're like, you're going to see later with the Federal Reserve. They're like, we will never do the things that are about to completely happen. And then it's like, okay, well, a tree by its fruit. If you believe the lies, then like that's on you. But the history and the fruit of the tree like is what it is. So someone can tell you they're a good person, but if you keep on catching them killing people, you might deduce that they are maybe not a good person and also a little bit of a liar, Anyways, the rise of the Rothschilds, this is about that time. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschilds dominated all European banking, and they were the wealthy family in the entire world. They financed Cecil Rhodes, making the diamond and gold monopoly possible in Africa. In America, they financed the Vanderbilts and railroads and press and Carnegie and steel, among many others. During World War I, J.P. Morgan was thought to be the richest man in America, but after his death, it was discovered that he was actually only a lieutenant of the Rothschilds, and once Morgan's will was made public, it was discovered that he only owned 19% of J.P. Morgan companies, and the rest was owned by the Rothschilds. And there's no evidence that their predominant standing in European and world finance has since changed. So the British Revolution dying down after 50 years of war, you got then the money control firmly in the grip of the money changers who just exhausted the economy and the resources in like the whole country and have totally magnified the debt and totally destroyed the economy. And so then that happens for, I guess, 100 years. And by that time, you're looking at the richest family in the world being the Rothschilds, which now we get into the history of. Benjamin Franklin was a big supporter of the colonies printing their own paper money, and in 1757, Benjamin Franklin was sent to London, and he stayed there for the next 18 years, nearly until the start of the American Revolution. During this time, the American colonies began to issue their own money, So you guys have probably heard of this. I hope you've heard of this. Colonial script. They should have taught you this in school. We had our own money called colonial script, and it was a very successful endeavor as it provided a viable medium for exchange, and it helped provide a unique feeling of unity between the colonies. The colonial script was paper money, debt-free, and it was printed in the public interest and not backed by gold or silver. In other words, it was just a totally fiat currency, and it was not owned by anyone. It was owned by the people. Officials from the Bank of England asked Ben Franklin how he would account for the newfound prosperity of the colonies, and without hesitation, Ben Franklin replied, "That's simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It's called colonial script. We issue it in proper proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own paper money. We control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to no one." Love you, Ben Franklin. What happened, though? This was common sense to the founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin being no different. Like, this was common sense to them. And America had basically learned the secret of money, and to the money changers and the Bank of England and the Rothschilds, that genie had to be returned to its bottle as soon as possible. As a result, Parliament quickly passed the Currency Act of 1764. This prohibited colonial officials from issuing their own money and ordering them to pay all future taxes in gold or silver coin. That's what the Currency Act of 1764 created. And in other words, it forced the colonies on a gold or silver standard. What happened? In 1 year, the conditions were so reversed that the era of prosperity ended and a depression set in to such an extent that the streets of the colonies were filled with unemployed. Those are the words of Benjamin Franklin. That is a quote, that in 1 year, the conditions were so reversed that the era of prosperity ended and a depression set in to such an extent that the streets of the colonies were filled with the unemployed. So they're sitting here selling you like, land of the free, home of the brave. Like, yeah, that happened for like a year. And then the Bank of England and the Rothschilds are like, oh, what are you guys going to do with it since you figured it out? And they're like, oh, we're just going to keep on issuing our own money. And then like, oh yeah, no, you're not. Like, we're going to fucking come fight you. And here we're going to learn about exactly how that happened and how it's happening today. And you sit there and tell yourself you're free and proud and all that, like you're a slave and proud maybe, but not free. The founding fathers had the right idea, the Constitution, right idea. It never happened. It didn't happen. They fought it. Like, it sounds great, but it didn't happen. It just didn't. So Franklin claims that this was the cause of the American Revolution. Literally, that again, this being the Currency Act of 1764 reversed the prosperity of America, and they got put on a gold and silver standard where they were forced to use those coins. And in 1 year, it caused so much unemployment and all that basically Franklin claims in his autobiography that this was the cause of the American Revolution. He says in his autobiography, quote, "The colonies would gladly have borne a little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. The inability of the colonies to get the power to issue their own money permanently out of the hands of George III and the international bankers was the primary reason for the Revolutionary War." That is a quote from his autobiography. That is why the American Revolution happened. We know it's why the England Revolution happened. Like, fuck, the England people were fighting the money changers. Like, the government was fighting the damn people in their own country, and they lost. And then, like, oh, well, they lost to their own country. Well, now that country's going to come and put their fascist, like, model on America, and it totally worked. Like, I mean, it got fought. Like, we still got to read the history of the fight, but to this day, like, the fight's not ongoing. Like, you'll have people that fight it, and then the fight will die down after the control has been regained or changed or whatever, and then it's just, again, until someone wants to fight it, and then it just sits in the hands of who it sits in. But the idea is there, and the model is made, and we live it today. It hasn't been put to bed, sadly. It exists. Every nation has that same fractional reserve lending model, Bank of England model. It's to this day. Sad but true. We're going to learn about all these presidents that died over it. You've heard the story before. It's just maybe not in a straight line. By the time the first shots were fired in Lexington, Massachusetts in 1775 of the American Revolution, the colonies had been drained of gold and silver coin by British taxation, and as a result, the continental government had no choice but to print money to finance the war. So at the start of the Revolution, the U.S. money supply stood at $12 million, and by the end of the war, it was nearly $500 million. As a result, the currency was virtually worthless. Shoes sold for $5,000 a pair. Sounds familiar. Colonial script worked because just enough was issued to facilitate trade. As George Washington put it, quote, "A wagon load of money will scarcely purchase a wagon load of provisions." Towards the end of the Revolution, the Continental Congress meeting at Independence Hall grew desperate for money, and in 1781 they allowed Robert Morris, their financial superintendent, to open a privately owned central bank. Incidentally, Morris was a wealthy man who had grown wealthier during the Revolution by trading war materials. Called the Bank of North America, the new bank was closely modeled after the Bank of England, and it was allowed to practice fractional reserve lending. That is, it could lend out more money than it had and then charge interest on it. If we did that today, you or I, that would be called fraud, and it's a felony. So here's another Thomas Jefferson quote. Quote, "If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations which grow up around them will deprive the people of their property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered." Oof. Hitting that quote. Play it back if you need to. I'm not going to say it again, but that one is, yeah, good shit, Thomas Jefferson. Here's another one, quote by Robert Morris. This is your banker, man. Quote, "The rich will strive to establish their dominion and enslave the rest. They always did. They always will. They have the same effect here as elsewhere. If we do not, by the power of government, keep them in their proper spheres." So that's Robert Morris. That's the guy that set up the Bank of North America. And it was pretty much modeled after the Bank of England, but it was not under their control. But nonetheless, basically the idea for the Bank of England and anyone trying to get into this, the reason they're into it is because they think, let me issue and control a nation's money, and I care not who writes their laws. The money thing to them is way more important because they can control everything. Money buys politics and influence, it does. In 1790, the newly appointed first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, proposed a bill to Congress calling for a new privately owned central bank. Coincidentally, that was the very year that the Rothschild family made their pronouncement from their flagship bank in Frankfurt. So Alexander Hamilton was a tool of the international bankers, and he wanted to create the U.S. Bank, or the Bank of the United States, the BUS, and he did so. So after a year of intense debate in 1791, Congress passed a bill that gave a 20-year charter, and this new bank was to be called the First Bank of the United States, or the BUS, Bank of the United States. It's located in Philadelphia, and the bank was given a monopoly on printing U.S. currency, even though 80% of its stock would be held by private investors. The other 20% would be purchased by the U.S. government, but not for the reason of letting the government get on the action. It was so that they could provide the capital for the other 80% owners. As with the Bank of North America and the Bank of England before it, the stockholders never pay the full amount for their shares. The U.S. government put up their 20%, which was $2 million, and then the bank, through the magic of fractional reserve lending, they made out loans to their investors to come up with the remaining $8 million or 80% that they needed for their risk-free investment. So you see how that works? Fractional reserve lending, they didn't even, it was risk-free for them to just, make us their slaves. We don't even have to worry about, it would be a good deal even if you had to pay the money up front, much less if you never even had to come up with remember there was supposed to be 1.25 million. They only came up with 750,000 of the pounds, and then they still ran the economy 16 million into oblivion in the first few years. You see what I'm saying? It's insanity. But as with the same thing, like the Bank of England, the name the Bank of the United States was deliberately chosen to hide the fact that it was privately controlled. And like the Bank of England, the names of the investors in the bank were never really revealed, even though many years later it was a common saying that the Rothschilds were the power behind the Bank of the United States. And we know they are the Bank of England. They're the most rich family in the world. How would they not be behind it? Oh, yeah, they're the richest family in the world, but they're not in control of the banks. Oh, you mean the people that make all the money? Then who is? How'd they get to be the richest in the world? It's just gross. Anyways, the bank was sold to Congress as a way to bring stability to the banking system and eliminate inflation. So what happened? Over the first 5 years, the U.S. government borrowed $8.2 million from the Bank of the United States, and in the same 5-year period, prices rose by 72%. That doesn't sound like stability. Jefferson, as the new Secretary of State, watched the borrowing in sadness and frustration, unable to stop it. Quoted saying, "I wish it were possible to obtain a single amendment of our Constitution, taking from the federal government their power of borrowing." Thomas Jefferson didn't even want us to be able to borrow money. Shouldn't happen. Many helpless, frustrated Americans feel the same way as they watch the Federal Reserve and the federal government borrow the American economy into oblivion. Really just the federal government via the Federal Reserve. Because again, that's the single greatest creditor of the United States is the Federal Reserve, privately owned. Here's another quote by Napoleon Bonaparte. The hand that gives is above the hand that takes. Money has no motherland. Financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is gain. In 1811, a bill was put in front of Congress to renew the charter of the Bank of the United States, and the debate became very heated, and legislators of both Pennsylvania and Virginia passed the resolutions asking Congress to kill the bank. The press corps of the day attacked the bank openly, calling it a great swindle, a vulture, a viper, and a cobra. See, this was before World War I, where like the press would say, like, oh, the banks, these bankers, they're trying to take over the world. Like, you can like look up an 1800s newspaper and read about it, but not after World War I. They owned the press. But to have an independent press once again in America, that would be nice, wouldn't it? Congressman P.V. Porter attacked the bank from the Congress floor, saying that if the bank's charter was renewed, quote, we will have planted in the bosom of the Constitution a viper, which one day or another will sting the liberties of this country to the heart. Nathan Rothschild even warned that the United States would find itself in a most disastrous war if the bank's charter was not renewed. Literally, Nathan Rothschild, the smartest of the Rothschild's 5 sons, is sitting there threatening the United States, saying if you do not renew the bank's 20-year charter, giving us another 20-year monopoly, you're going to find yourself in a war you don't want to be in. Like, do you hear that? Like, that is bully. That is, like, that's the mob. That's the like, that's the mentality of, like, you see what I'm saying? Like, that's how these guys work. It's badass, but it's not good. Like, I'm in charge. You give me a reason. We got more guns than you. Like, that's how it goes, man. Like, and this is the biggest gun, the control of the money. That is the atomic bomb. Like, it's more dangerous than the atomic bomb. It is, and they know that, and that's why they're cunning. They know how to manipulate. Anyways, when the smoke cleared, the renewal bill was defeated by a single vote in the House, and it was deadlock in Senate. But by this time, the United States' 4th president, James Madison, was in the White House, and he was an opponent of the bank. His vice president, George Clinton, broke the tie in the Senate and sent the bank into oblivion. And within 5 months, England attacked the U.S., and the War of 1812 was on. So you see how that works? Literally a president, which they don't care who the president is. Like, I don't even want to get into if you believe that, like, president's rigged or not. It doesn't matter, because what does matter is that whether you believe in the president being rigged or not, there are families that have enough money to buy political influence to get their guys in places. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, literally, if they don't like who the president is, if they can't control them, they will send you to war. They will put your economy in a point where you will go to war with them, if no one else. Like, because you'll have no money because they control. Like, you'll have no money. They took 90% of the money out of the fucking Roman. They issue the money. If you go spend your money and it goes back to the bank, and if they don't put any more out into the economy, you see what I'm saying? Like, they turn the water off, and everyone needs water, and we've let them have control of the pipes. Like, you fight these guys, or you try and stand up to them, and they send you into a war, and that's exactly what happened. Like, this is one of the first few times, you got the England Revolution, American Revolution. Now we're to the War of 1812. It's the same thing every time. We'll go through World War I, World War II. It's the same thing every time. Somebody fights them, and they're like, well, we'll go to war. And they make it happen, and here's how. So James Madison was an opponent of the bank. His vice president, George Clinton, broke the tie, and they sent the bank into oblivion, not rechartering it, and it pissed them off. And within 5 months, England attacked the United States, and the War of 1812 was on. But these arrogant assholes, British was still busy fighting Napoleon, and so the War of 1812 ended in a draw in 1814. They're like, we'll go to war with you. Oh, shit, we're already at war with other people. Like, ignorant. Because these bankers, they're not going to war. They're just sending the troops to the country that they control via controlling their economy, you see? So though the money changers were temporarily down, they were far from out. It would take only another 2 years to bring back their bank stronger than ever. In March 1815, Napoleon equipped an army with Britain's Duke of Wellington. They were defeated less than 90 days later at Waterloo. From this point on, it was not unusual for privately owned banks to finance both sides in a war. This is a kicker. Wrap your head around this. Like, you guys think you know how the world works. This is history that, like, is a fucking silly pill to swallow. From the point on of the War of 1812, it was common for banks to finance both sides in a war. Now, you might ask yourself, why would a bank finance opposing sides in a war? If you got money and you want a guy to win, and you give him money to win. Why would you go give both guys money to watch them fight unless you just, like, love war? Because war is the biggest debt generator of them all, and a nation will borrow any amount of money for victory, and they're borrowing the money of the lender. You see that? Oh, how convenient is that? The ultimate loser is loaned out just enough to hold out the vain hope of victory, and the ultimate winner is predetermined and given enough to win. Besides, these loans are always conditioned upon the guarantee that the victor will pay the debts of the vanquished. Oh, how perfect is that? Like, the bank gets their money either way. Napoleon suffered his final defeat, but not before thousands of French and Englishmen gave their lives on a steamy summer day in July 1815. 74,000 French troops met 67,000 troops from Britain and other European nations. The outcome of this battle was certainly in doubt, and in fact, if Napoleon had attacked a few hours later, he probably would have won the battle, but it didn't really matter who won, because back in London, Nathan Rothschild had planned to use this opportunity to try and seize control over the British stock market and bond market, possibly even the Bank of England. So here was his plan. Rothschild, he stationed a trusted agent, a man named Rothworth, on the north side of the battlefield closer to the English Channel, and once the battle had been decided, Rothworth took off for the Channel, and he delivered the news to Nathan Rothschild a full 24 hours before Wellington's own carrier. So Nathan Rothschild hurried to the stock market and took up his usual position in front of an ancient pillar, and all eyes were on him, as the Rothschilds had a legendary communications network. If Wellington had been defeated and Napoleon was loose on the continent again, Britain's financial situation would become grave indeed. The Rothschilds knew this, and so as Nathan Rothschild took up his position, he looked saddened. He stood there motionless, eyes downcast, and then he suddenly began selling. So other nervous investors saw that he was selling, and to them this could only mean one thing. Napoleon must have won and Wellington must have lost. So this being the case, the market plummeted in England, and soon everyone was selling their consols, their British government bonds, and prices dropped sharply. Then something happened. A couple hours later, Rothschild started secretly buying up the consols through his agents for only a fraction of their worth hours before. So Rothschild, after he sells and everyone else sells, he sends his men out there in secret to go and buy up everything that just got sold at a fraction of what its value was a few hours prior to that, due to his perceived knowledge in the market. See that finesse? It's probably the greatest finesse that ever happened, ever maybe, aside from Fort Knox, which we're going to get to that one in this same podcast. But if you think this is a myth, you think this is a legend, 100 years later, the New York Times ran a story which said that Nathan Rothschild's grandson had attempted to secure a court order to suppress a book with this stock market story in it. And the Rothschild family claimed that the story was untrue and libelous, but the court denied the Rothschilds' request and ordered the family to pay all the court costs. What's even more interesting about the story is that some authors claim that days after the Battle of Waterloo, in a matter of hours, Nathan Rothschild came to dominate not only the bond market, but the Bank of England as well. Oh, it's not true. Well, you put your man on the north side of the battlefield. He got back. He delivered you the news. You went and sold your stocks. Everyone else did. Then you went and bought the stocks. And then the news came back to town that they won and the economy went back up. You say it's not true, then why the hell were you the richest man in the world after that? And why has it been the case ever since? Whether or not the Rothschild family seized control of the Bank of England, the first privately owned central bank in a major European nation and the wealthiest, one thing is for certain, that by the mid-1800s, the Rothschilds were the richest family in the world, bar none. So that's not conspiracy. And if they're the richest family in the world, I can only imagine how they got there. Can't tell me on accident. Them as a family at the turn of the century, their wealth, they had more wealth as a family in one family as the rest of the world. It was like if everybody in every family in the world had $1, so do the Rothschilds, and there's only $2 in the world. Like they had 50% of the entire world's wealth, the entire world, in the 1900s. And now we're 120 years later, and nothing's changed. If anything, it's gotten worse. See what I'm saying? It's disgusting how lopsided it is. The Rothschilds, they dominated the new government bond markets, and they branched into other banks and industrial concerns. And it's a fact that the rest of the 19th century was known as the Age of the Rothschilds. Despite this overwhelming wealth, the family has generally cultivated an aura of invisibility. Although the family controls scores of industrial, commercial, mining, and tourist corporations, they only have a few that bear the Rothschild name. And by the end of the 19th century, one expert estimated that the Rothschild family controlled half of the wealth of the world. Whatever the extent of the wealth is, it's reasonable to assume that their percentage of the world's wealth has increased since then. And since the turn of the century being the age of the Rothschilds, they have created and cultivated the notion that somehow that their power has waned even as their wealth increases. You know, they haven't discredited that their wealth increases, that just more so than not that their power has, but that's the same thing. They just have created an aura of invisibility. Meanwhile, back in Washington in 1816, just 1 year after Waterloo, the Rothschilds' alleged takeover of the Bank of England, the American Congress passed a bill permitting yet another privately owned central bank. So, as if the War of 1812 wasn't enough, and the American Revolution, here we go again. So now we had the Bank of the United States, the bus, whatever. Now we got the second Bank of the United States. That was what came in after this, after 1816, and basically after the Rothschilds' alleged takeover of the Bank of England. It was followed by the second Bank of the United States, which was a new bank, and it had a charter that was a copy of the previous banks. And again, here we go. The U.S. government would own 20% of the bank's shares. And, of course, the federal share was paid by the Treasury up front into the bank's coffers, and then through the magic of fractional reserve lending, it was transformed into loans to private investors who then bought the remaining 80% of the shares. Risk-free investment. Just as before, the primary stockholders remained a secret. The Rothschilds sit there and act like they didn't do it, all because they somehow covered up their names and not being shown as the primary stockholders. But it is known that the largest block of shares, about 1/3 of the total, was sold to foreigners. And as one observer put it, it is no exaggeration to say that the Second Bank of the United States was rooted as deeply in Britain as it was America. So by 1816, some authors claim that the Rothschilds had taken over the Bank of England and backed a new privately owned bank in America as well. After 12 years of manipulations of the United States economy on the part of the second bank of the U.S., the American people had had just about enough. Opponents of the bank nominated a dignified senator from Tennessee named Andrew Jackson. He was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, and he ran for president. No one gave Jackson a chance initially, however, he won. The bank had long learned how the political process could be controlled by money, but nonetheless, to a surprise and dismay of the money changers, Jackson was swept into office in 1828. Jackson was determined to kill the bank, and at the first opportunity, he tried. He wasted no time in trying to do so, but the bank's 20-year charter didn't come up for renewal until 1836, which would be the last year of his second term if he could survive that long. During his first term, Jackson contented himself with rooting out the bank's many minions from government service. He fired 2,000 of the 11,000 employees of the federal government. That's awesome. In 1832, with his reelection approaching, the bank struck an early blow, hoping Jackson would not want to stir up controversy. They asked Congress to pass a renewal bill 4 years early. Naturally, Congress complied and sent it to the president for signing, but Jackson weighed in with both feet. Old Hickory, never a coward, vetoed the bill, and his veto message is one of the great American documents. It clearly lays out the responsibility of the American government towards its citizens, rich and poor. He is quoted saying, "It is not our own citizens only who are to receive the bounty of our government. More than 8 millions of the stock of this bank are held by foreigners. Is there no danger to our liberty and independence in a bank that is in its nature has so little to bind it to our country? Controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens' independence would be more formidable and dangerous than a military power of the enemy. If government would confine itself to equal protection and as it rains, shower its favor alike on high and low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. And the act before me seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles." So all of that was a quote by Andrew Jackson attacking the bank. Later in the year in 1832, Congress was unable to override Jackson's veto, and now Jackson had to stand for re-election. Jackson took his argument directly to the people, and for the first time in U.S. history, Jackson took his presidential campaign on the road. Before then, presidential candidates stayed home and looked presidential. His, however, campaign slogan was Jackson and no bank, and the National Republican Party ran Senator Henry Clay against Jackson. Despite the fact that the bankers poured more than $3 million into the opponent Clay's campaign, Jackson was reelected by a landslide in November 1832, and despite his presidential victory, Jackson knew that this battle was only beginning. President Jackson was quoted saying, "The hydra of corruption is only scotched, not dead." Jackson ordered his new Secretary of Treasury, Lewis McLean, to start removing the government's deposits from the second bank and start placing them in safe banks, but McLean refused to do so. So Jackson fired him and appointed William J. Duane as the new Secretary of Treasury, and Duane also refused to comply with the president's request, and so Jackson fired him as well, and then appointed a third, Roger B. Taney, to the office, and Taney did withdraw government funds from the bank starting on October 1st, 1833. Following this, the head of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, used his influence to get the Senate to reject Taney's nomination. Then, in a rare show of arrogance, Biddle threatened to cause a depression if the bank was not rechartered. Sounds familiar. Our boy Nathan Rothschild did the same thing with the War of 1812 after not rechartering the bank that got us into the War of 1812. And that was that bank, and now we have a second one set up, and here we go again. They're not threatening a war this time. They're threatening a depression if the bank was not rechartered. Nicholas Biddle even was quoted saying, quote, "This worthy president thinks that because he has scalped Indians and imprisoned judges that he is to have his way with the bank. He is mistaken." Pam, kitty. Pam, Pammy. Come here, kitty. I breed Bengal cats, and they're great companions, but they're very curious. If you ever are looking for a champion Bengal kitty, I'm your guy. That was, again, Nicholas Biddle that said that. And in an unbelievable fit of honesty for a central banker, Nicholas Biddle admitted that the bank was going to make money scarce to force Congress to restore the bank. So that's really the only two weapons they have. They can make money scarce to cripple the economy, to make you restore them, or they can basically send you to war by either coming at you themselves or sending someone else at you by crippling other economies. They just completely use whatever means necessary to cripple you financially or physically via war and making money scarce. Another quote by Nicholas Biddle is, "Nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effect on Congress. Our only safety is in pursuing a steady course of firm restriction, and I have no doubt that such a course will ultimately lead to the restoration of the currency and the recharter of the bank." Nicholas Biddle. Nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effect on Congress. Yeah, thanks. Well, that's your opinion, and you want to control the whole world, and you're ready to cause nothing but widespread suffering to get your effect. So that's just great. Biddle intended to use the money contraction power of the bank to cause massive depressions until America gave in. And unfortunately, this has happened time and time again throughout the U.S. history, and it's about to happen again today. So nothing new. They can send you to war. They can cripple the economy sending you to war. That's what they do, and that's what they can do. They can murder the guy that's opposing them. That's what they do, and you'll see. But as we continue, we haven't gotten to any of the murders yet, but we will. That's some of the most fun and blatant, obvious. Nonetheless, Nicholas Biddle made good on his threat. The bank sharply contracted the money supply by calling in old loans and refusing to extend new ones. Financial panic ensued, and this followed by a deep depression. Naturally, Biddle blamed Jackson for the crash, saying it was caused by the withdrawal of federal funds from the bank. And unfortunately, his plan worked well. Wages and prices sagged, unemployment soared, along with business bankruptcies. The nation quickly went up in an uproar. Newspaper editors quickly blasted Jackson in editorials, and the bank threatened to withhold payments, which then could be made directly to key politicians for their support. Within only months, Congress assembled what was called the Panic Session. 6 months after he had withdrawn funds from the bank, Jackson was officially censured by resolution, which passed the Senate by a vote of 26-20. It was the first time a president had ever been censured by Congress. Jackson lashed out at the bank, saying, "You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by God eternal, I will rout you out." America's fate at this point teetered on a knife's edge. If Congress could muster enough votes to override Jackson's veto, the bank would be granted another 20-year monopoly or more over America's money. Time enough to consolidate its already great power. However, a miracle then occurred. The governor of Pennsylvania came out supporting President Jackson and strongly criticized the bank. On top of that, Biddle had been caught boasting in public about the bank's plan to crash the economy. Suddenly, the tide shifted. In April of 1834, the House of Representatives voted 134-82 against rechartering the bank, and this was followed by an even more lopsided vote to establish a special committee to investigate whether the bank had caused the crash. That was about as close as we ever were to having the common man and everyone realize point blank, verbatim, what this black sheep is and where it's at and how to kill it. However, when the investigating committee arrived at the bank doors in Philadelphia, armed with a subpoena to look at the books, Biddle refused to give them up, nor would he allow inspection of correspondence with congressmen relating to their personal loans and advances he had made to them. He also refused to testify before the committee back in Washington. On January 8, 1835, Jackson paid off the final installment on the national debt, which had been necessitated by allowing the banks to issue currency for government bonds rather than simply issuing treasury notes without such debt. He was the only president ever to pay off the debt. Thank you, Andrew Jackson. Don't say it can't happen. Andrew Jackson paid off the national debt. A few weeks later, on January 30th, 1835, an assassin by the name of Richard Lawrence tried to shoot President Jackson, but by the grace of God, both pistols misfired. Lawrence was later found not guilty by reason of insanity, and after his release, he bragged to friends that powerful people in Europe had put him up to the task and promised to protect him if he were caught. The following year, when his charter ran out, the Second Bank of the United States ceased functioning as the nation's central bank. Biddle was later arrested and charged with fraud, and he was tried and acquitted, but died shortly thereafter while still tied up in civil suits. After his second term as president, Jackson retired to Nashville to live out his life, where he is still remembered for his determination to kill the bank. In fact, he killed it so well that it took the money changers 77 years to undo the damage. And when asked what his most important accomplishment had been, Jackson replied, "I killed the bank." Unfortunately, even Jackson failed to grasp the entire picture and its root cause. Although Jackson had killed the central bank, the most insidious weapon of the money changers, fractional reserve banking, remained in use by the numerous state-chartered banks. This fueled economic instability in the years before the Civil War. Still, the central bankers were out, and as a result, America thrived as it expanded westward. During this time, the principal money changers struggled to regain their lost centralized power, but to no avail. Then finally, they reverted to the old central bankers' formula, war to create debt and dependency. If they couldn't get their central bank any other way, America could be brought to its knees by plunging it into a civil war, just as they had done in 1812 after the first Bank of the United States was not rechartered. 1 month after the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, the first shots of the American Civil War were fired on April 12, 1861. Certainly slavery was a cause of the Civil War, but not the primary cause. Lincoln knew that the economy of the South depended on slavery, so before the Civil War had even began, he had no intention of eliminating it. Lincoln had put it this way in his inaugural address only 1 month earlier. Quote, "I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it now exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." End quote. Abraham Lincoln. Here's another one by Lincoln. Quote, "My paramount objective is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it." That's Abraham Lincoln's, one of his quotes. Another quote here by Otto von Bismarck. This is one of your German or Russian guys. Anyways, quote, "The division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by high financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States, if remained as one bloc, as one nation, would attain economic and financial independence, which would upset their financial domination over the world." Exactly right, Otto von Bismarck. No matter what the outcome of the Civil War, a weakened America heavily in debt to the money changers would open up a Central and South America once again to European colonization and domination, and the very thing America's Monroe Doctrine had forbade in 1823. Lincoln knew he was in a double bind, and that's why he agonized over the fate of the Union. There was a lot more to it than just the differences between the North and South, and that's why his emphasis was on the Union and not merely the defeat of the South. But Lincoln needed money to win. And in 1861, Lincoln and his Secretary of the Treasury went to New York to apply for the necessary loans. The money changers, anxious to see the Union fail, offered loans at 24 to 36% interest. Lincoln said thanks, but no thanks, and returned to Washington. Lincoln sent for an old friend, Colonel Dick Taylor of Chicago, and put him on the problem of financing the war. And during one meeting, Lincoln asked Taylor what he discovered. Taylor put it this way, quote, "Why, Lincoln, it's easy. Just get Congress to pass a bill authorizing the printing of full legal tender treasury notes, and you pay your soldiers with them and go ahead and win your war with them also." That was Colonel Dick Taylor. And when Lincoln asked if the people of the United States will accept the notes, Taylor said, quote, "The people or anyone else will not have any choice in the matter. If you make them full legal tender, they will have the full sanction of the government and be just as good as any money, as Congress is given that express right by the Constitution." Colonel Dick Taylor. Way to point out that Congress is given that express right by the Constitution. So that's exactly what Lincoln did. In 1862 to 63, he printed up $450 million worth of new bills. And in order to distinguish them from other banknotes in circulation, he printed them with green ink on the backside. And that's why the notes were called greenbacks. Probably have heard of them. This new money, Lincoln paid the troops, and he bought their supplies. There was $450 million worth of the greenbacks that were printed, and it was at no interest to the federal government. That's the key right there. Money created with no interest to the federal government, or to a Federal Reserve, which is a private company. Either way. Lincoln understood who was really pulling the strings and what was at stake for the American people, and this is how he explained his rationale. Quote, "The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and buying power of the consumers. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of the government, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity. By adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be master and become servant of humanity." Abraham Lincoln, what a guy. He understood. A truly incredible editorial in the London Times explained the central banker's attitude towards Lincoln's greenbacks. Quote, "If this mischievous financial policy, which has its origin in North America, shall become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. Good. It will pay off its debts and be without debt. Good. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. Good. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. Great. The brains and the wealth of all countries will go to America. That country must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." So says Times of London. So, the scheme was so effective that the next year in 1863, with the Federal and Confederate troops beginning to mass for the decisive battle of the Civil War and the Treasury in need of further congressional authority to issue more greenbacks, Lincoln allowed the bankers to push through the National Bank Act. These new national banks would operate under a virtual tax-free status and collectively have the exclusive monopoly and power to create the new form of money, banknotes. Greenbacks continued to circulate, their numbers would not increase, but more importantly, from this point on, the entire U.S. money supply would be created out of debt by bankers buying U.S. government bonds and issuing them for reserves for banknotes. As one historian put it, quote, "In numerous years following the war, the federal government ran a heavy surplus. It could not, however, pay off its debts, retire its securities, because to do so meant that there would be no bonds to back the national banknotes. To pay off the debt was to destroy the money supply." Later in 1863, Lincoln got some unexpected help from Alexander II of Russia. Alexander, like Bismarck in Germany, so Otto von Bismarck is from Germany, not Russia. Otto von Bismarck in Germany knew what the international money changers were up to, and he had steadfastly refused to let them set up a central bank in Russia. So that's why I thought it was Germany or Russia. It's like the man was German, or he was in Germany, but he was fighting for Russia. Whatever. If America survived and was able to remain out of the clutches, Alexander's position would remain secure. If the bankers were successful at dividing America and giving the pieces back to Great Britain and France, both nations under control of central banks, eventually they would threaten Russia again. So Alexander gave orders that if either England or France actively intervened and gave aid to the South, Russia would consider such an action as a declaration of war. He did the same with part of his Pacific fleet and sent them to port in San Francisco. Lincoln was reelected the next year in 1864, and had he lived, he would have surely killed the national bank's money monopoly extracted from him during the war. On November 21st, 1864, he wrote a friend the following, quote, "The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy." End quote. Abraham Lincoln. On April 14th, 1865, 41 days after his second inauguration, and just 5 days after Lee surrendered to Grant, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. Bismarck, Chancellor of Germany, lamented the death of Abraham Lincoln, saying, quote, "The death of Lincoln was a disaster for Christendom. There was no man in the United States great enough to wear his boots. I fear that the foreign bankers, with their craftiness and tortuous tricks, will entirely control the exuberant riches of America and use it systematically to corrupt modern civilization. They will not hesitate to plunge the whole of Christendom into wars and chaos in order that the earth should become their inheritance." End quote. Otto von Bismarck. Beautifully said. Bismarck well understood the money changers' plan. Allegations that international bankers were responsible for Lincoln's assassination surfaced in Canada 70 years later in 1934. Gerald G. McGeer, a popular and well-respected Canadian attorney, revealed the stunning charge in a 5-hour speech before the Canadian House of Commons, blasting Canada's debt-based money system. Remember, it was 1934, the Great of the Depression, which was ravaging Canada as well. McGeer had obtained evidence deleted from the public record provided to him by Secret Service agents at the trial of John Wilkes Booth after Booth's death. McGeer said that it showed that Booth was a mercenary working for the international bankers. There it is. Guy that killed Lincoln. Same with the dude bragging trying to kill fucking Andrew Jackson. Like, he bragged that powerful people with the Bank of England put him up to it and they'd protect him if anything happened. Same thing happens today with the Epstein stuff. According to an article in the Vancouver Sun of May 2nd, 1934, Abraham Lincoln, the martyred emancipator of the slaves, was assassinated through the machinations of a group representative of the international bankers who feared the United States president's national credit ambitions. There was only one group in the world at that time who had any reason to desire the death of Lincoln. They were the men opposed to his national currency program and who had fought him throughout the whole Civil War on his policy of greenback currency. McGeer claimed that Lincoln was assassinated not only because international bankers wanted to reestablish a central bank in America, but because they also wanted to base America's currency on gold they controlled. In other words, put America on a gold standard. Lincoln had done just the opposite by issuing U.S. notes, greenbacks, which were based purely on the good faith and credit of the United States. The article quoted McGeer saying, quote, "They were the men interested in the establishment of the gold standard money system and the right of the bankers to manage the currency and credit of every nation in the world. With Lincoln out of the way, they were able to proceed with that plan, and they did proceed with that plan in the United States. With 8 years after Lincoln's assassination, silver was demonetized and the gold standard money system was set up in the United States. Not since Lincoln has the U.S. issued debt-free United States notes. The red sealed bills which were issued in 1963 were not a new issue from President Kennedy, but merely the old greenbacks reissued year after year. In another act of folly and ignorance, the 1994 Regal Act authorized the replacement of Lincoln's greenbacks with debt-based notes. In other words, greenbacks were in circulation in the United States until 1994. Why was silver bad for bankers and gold good? Simply because silver was plentiful in the United States and it was hard to control. Gold was and always has been scarce, and throughout history it has been relatively easy to monopolize gold, while silver has been about 15 times more plentiful. With Lincoln out of the way, the money changers' next objective was to gain complete control over America's money. This was no easy task. With the opening of the American West, silver had been discovered in huge quantities, and on top of that, Lincoln's greenbacks were generally popular. Despite the European central bankers' deliberate attack on greenbacks, they continued to circulate in the United States. Quote, right after the Civil War, there was considerable talk about reviving Lincoln's brief experiment with the constitutional monetary system. Had not the European Money Trust intervened, it would have no doubt become an established institution. W. Cleon Skousen. It is clear that the concept of America printing her own debt-free money sent shockwaves throughout the European central banking elite. They watched with horror as Americans clamored for more greenbacks. They may have killed Abraham Lincoln, but support for his monetary ideas grew. On April 12, 1866, nearly 1 year to the day of Lincoln's assassination, Congress went to work at the bidding of the European central banking interests. It passed the Contraction Act, authorizing the Secretary of the Treasury to begin to retire some of the greenbacks in circulation and therefore contract the money supply. Authors Theodore R. Thorin and Richard F. Warner explain the results of the money contraction in their classic book on the subject of The Truth in Money book. The hard times which occurred after the Civil War could have been avoided if the greenback legislation had continued as President Lincoln had intended. Instead, there was a series of money panics, what we call recessions, which put pressure on Congress to enact legislation to place the banking system under centralized control. Eventually, the Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 23, 1913. In other words, the money changers wanted two things: the reinstitution of a central bank under their exclusive control and an American currency backed by gold. Their strategy was twofold. First of all, cause a series of panics to convince the American people that only centralized control of money supply could provide economic stability, and secondly, remove so much money from the system that most Americans would be so desperately poor that they either wouldn't care or would be too weak to oppose the bankers. In 1866, there was $1.8 billion in currency in circulation in the United States, about $50.46 per capita. In 1867 alone, $500 million was removed from the money supply, and in 10 years later, in 1876, America's money supply was reduced to only $600 million. In other words, two-thirds of America's money had been called in by the bankers. Only $14.60 per capita remained in circulation. 10 years later, the money supply had been reduced to only $400 million, even though the population had boomed. The result of this was that there was only $6.67 per capita in circulation. that was a 760% loss in buying power over 20 years. 760% loss in buying power in 20 years. When they said that, like, you got to have a central bank because it's the only way to prevent this stuff. Yeah, tell me you're not a liar and then fucking lie to me. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And that's what it is. It's happened more than twice, so it's shame on us. Today, economists try and sell the idea that recessions and depressions are a part of something they call the business cycle, but the truth is our money supply is manipulated now just as it was before the Civil War. How did this happen? How did money become so scarce? Simple. Bank loans were called in and no new ones were given. In addition, silver coins were melted down. In 1872, a man named Ernest Sed was given 100,000 pounds by the Bank of England and sent to America to bribe necessary congressmen to get silver demonetized. He was told that if it was not sufficient to draw an additional 100,000 pounds or as much more was necessary. The next year, Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1873, and the minting of silver dollars abruptly stopped. In fact, Representative Samuel Hooper, who introduced the bill in the House, acknowledged that Mr. Ernst Sed actually drafted the legislation. But it gets even worse than that. In 1874, Ernst Sed himself admitted who was behind the scheme. Quote, I went to America in the winter of 1872-73, authorized to secure, if I could, a passage of a bill demonetizing silver. It was in the interest of those I represented, the governors of the Bank of England, to have it done. By 1873, gold coins were the only form of coin money. But the contest over the control of America's money was not over. Only 3 years later, in 1876, with 1/3 of America's workforce unemployed, the population was growing restless, and people were clamoring for a return to greenback money, which was what President Lincoln had given us. People wanted a return to that money system or a return to silver money, anything that would make money more plentiful. But that year, Congress created the United States Silver Commission to study the problem. Their report clearly blamed the monetary contraction on the national bankers, and the report is still interesting because it compares the deliberate money contraction by the national bankers after the Civil War to the fall of the Roman Empire. So that's hilarious that you got the United States Silver Commission to study the problem, and their report clearly blames the fact that the money was contracted by national bankers, and they literally compare it to a deliberate money contraction on the same level of Rome and the cause of the fall of Rome. So the disaster of the Dark Ages, quote, the disaster of the Dark Ages was caused by decreasing money and falling prices. Without money, civilization could not have a beginning, and with a diminishing supply, it must languish, and unless relieved, it finally perish. Quote, at the Christian era of metallic money of the Roman Empire amounted to 1,800,000,000. By the end of the 15th century, it had shrunk to less than 200 million. History records no such other disastrous transition as that from the Roman Empire to the Dark Ages. End quote. United States Silver Commission. Despite this report by the Silver Commission, Congress took no action. The next year in 1877, riots broke out from Pittsburgh to Chicago. The torches of starving vandals lit up the sky. The bankers huddled, deciding what to do next, and they decided to hang on. Now that they were back in control to a certain extent, they were not about to give it up. At the meeting of the American Bankers Association the next year, they urged their membership to do everything in their power to put down the notion of a return to greenbacks. The ABA Secretary James Buell authored a letter to the members which blatantly called on the banks to subvert not only Congress, but the press as well. Quote, it is advisable to do all in your power to sustain such prominent daily and weekly newspapers, especially the agricultural and religious press, as will oppose the greenback issue of paper money, and that you will also withhold patronage from all applicants who are not willing to oppose the government issue of money. To repeal the act creating banknotes or to restore circulation the government issue of money will be to provide the people with money and will therefore seriously affect our individual profits as bankers and lenders. See your American congressman at once and engage him to support our interests that we may control legislation. End quote. James Buell, American Bankers Association, otherwise known as the ABA. Yeah, heartwarming stuff there. Love it. Gonna seriously affect our profits if the people can take care of themselves. Yeah. Seems pretty ethical. As political pressure mounted in Congress for change, the press tried to turn the American people away from the truth. The New York Tribune put it this way on January 10, 1878, quote, the capital of the country is organized at last, and we will see whether Congress will dare fly in its face. End quote. But it didn't work entirely. On February 28, 1878, Congress passed the Sherman Law, allowing the minting of a limited number of silver dollars, ending the 5-year hiatus. This did not end gold backing of the currency, however, nor did it completely free silver. Previous to 1873, anyone who brought silver to the U.S. Mint could have it struck into silver dollars free of charge. However, this is no longer. With no further threat to their control, the bankers loosened up on loans, and the post-Civil War depression was finally ended. 3 years later, the American people elected Republican James Garfield as president. Garfield understood how the economy was being manipulated. As a congressman, he had been chairman of the Appropriations Committee and was a member of Banking and Currency. After his inauguration, he slammed the money changers publicly in 1881, saying, quote, "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled one way or another by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." End quote, James Garfield. Unfortunately, within a few weeks of making this statement on July 2nd of 1881, President Garfield was assassinated. Reoccurring theme there, or it's going to be. No, we talked about it. Abe Lincoln, yeah. The money changers were gathering strength fast. They began a periodic fleecing of the flock, as they called it, creating economic booms followed by further depressions so that they could buy up thousands of homes and farms for pennies on the dollar. In 1891, the money changers prepared to take the American economy down again, and their methods and motives were laid out in shocking clarity in a memo sent out by the American Bankers Association, the ABA, an organization which most bankers remember. This memo called for bankers to create a depression on a certain date 3 years in the future. According to congressional record, here's how it read. Quote, "On September 1st, 1894, we will not renew our loans under any consideration. On September 1st, we will demand our money. We will foreclose and become mortgagees in possession. We can take 2/3 of the farms west of the Mississippi and thousands of them east of the Mississippi as well, all at our price. Then the farmers will become tenants as in England." End quote. 1891 American Bankers Association, as printed in the Congressional Record of April 29th, 1913. These depressions could be controlled because America was on the gold money standard, and since gold is scarce, it's one of the easiest commodities to manipulate. People wanted silver money legalized again so they could escape the stranglehold that the money changers had on gold money, and people wanted silver money reinstated, reversing Mr. Said's Act of 1873, by then called the Crime of 73. By 1896, issue of more silver money had become the central issue in the presidential campaign. William Jennings Bryan, a senator from Nebraska, ran for president as Democrat on the free silver issue. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, he made an emotional speech which won him the nomination, entitled, quote, "Crown of Thorns and Cross of Gold," end quote. Though Bryan was only 36 years old at the time, this speech is widely regarded as one of the most famous orations ever made before a political convention. In the dramatic conclusion, Bryan said, quote, "We will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, 'You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold,'" end quote. William Jennings Bryan. The bankers lavishly supported the Republican candidate, William McKinley, who favored the gold standard, and the result was among the most fiercely contested presidential races in American history. Bryan made over 600 speeches in 27 states, and the McKinley campaign got manufacturers and industrialists to inform their employees that if Bryan were elected, all plants and factories would close and there would be no work. Sadly, the ruse succeeded. McKinley beat Bryan by a small margin, and Bryan ran for president again in 1900 and 1908, but fell short each time. During the 1912 Democratic Convention, Bryan was a powerful figure who helped Woodrow Wilson win the nomination, and when Wilson became president, he appointed Bryan as Secretary of State, but Bryan soon became disenchanted with the Wilson administration, and he served only 2 years in the Wilson administration before resigning in 1915 over the highly suspicious sinking of the Lusitania, the event which was used to drive America into World War I. Although William Jennings Bryan never gained the presidency, his efforts delayed the money changers for 17 years from attaining their next goal, a new privately owned central bank for America. During the 1900s, men like J.P. Morgan led the charge for the financial panic that would be necessary to focus the nation's attention on the supposed need for a central bank. The rationale was that only a central bank could prevent bank failures. Morgan was clearly the most powerful banker in America and a suspected agent for the Rothschilds. Morgan had helped finance John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil empire, and he had also helped finance the monopolies of Edward Hurome in railroads, Carnegie in steel, and others in numerous industries. But on top of that, J.P. Morgan's father had been America's financial agent to the British, and after his father's death, J.P. Morgan took on a British partner, Edward Grenfell, a longtime director of the Bank of England. So there you go again, Bank of England, America, Rothschilds, Morgans. There's England version, American version. It's the same. In fact, upon Morgan's death, his estate contained only a few $1,000,000. The bulk of the securities most people thought he owned were owned by the Rothschilds. In 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt allegedly went after Morgan and his friends by using the Sherman Antitrust Act to try and break up their industrial monopolies. Actually, Roosevelt did very little to interfere with the growing monopolization of American industry by the bankers and their surrogates. For example, Roosevelt supposedly broke up the Standard Oil monopoly, but it wasn't really broken at all. It was merely divided into 7 corporations, all still controlled by the Rockefellers. So the public was well aware of this thanks to political cartoonists like Thomas Nast, who referred to the bankers as the money trust. By 1907, the year after Teddy Roosevelt's re-election, Morgan decided it was time for a central bank again. Using their combined financial muscle, Morgan and his friends were secretly able to crash the stock market. Thousands of small banks were vastly overextended. Some had reserves less than 1% thanks to fractional reserve lending and banking, same thing. Within days, bank runs were commonplace across the nation, and now Morgan stepped into the public arena and offered to prop up the faltering American economy by supporting failing banks with money he manufactured out of nothing. It was an outrageous proposal, far worse than even fractional reserve banking, but Congress let him do it. Morgan manufactured $200 million worth of this completely reserveless private money, and he bought things with it, he paid for services with it, and he even sent some of it to his branch banks to lend out at interest. Insanity. His plan worked. Soon the public regained confidence in money in general and quit hoarding their currency, but as a result, banking power was further consolidated into the hands of a few large banks. By 1908, the panic was over, and Morgan was hailed as a hero by the president of Princeton University, a man by the name of Woodrow Wilson. There you go. Quote, "All this trouble could have been averted if we appointed a committee of 6 or 7 public-spirited men like J.P. Morgan to handle the affairs of our country." End quote, Woodrow Wilson. Economic textbooks would later explain that the creation of the Federal Reserve System was the direct result of the Panic of 1907. Quote, "With its alarming epidemic of bank failures, the country was fed up once and for all with the anarchy of unstable private banking." But Minnesota Congressman Charles Lindbergh Sr., the father of the famous aviator Lucky Lindy, later explains that the Panic of 1907 was really just a scam. Quote, "Those not favorable to the money trust could be squeezed out of business and the people frightened into demanding changes in the banking and currency laws which the money trust would frame." End quote, Representative Charles A. Lindbergh. Since the passage of the National Bank Act of 1863, the money changers had been able to create a series of booms and busts. The purpose was not only to fleece the American public of their property, but to later claim that the banking system was basically so unstable that it had to be consolidated into a central bank once again. After the crash, Teddy Roosevelt, in response to the Panic of 1907, signed into law a bill creating something called the National Monetary Commission. The commission was to study the banking problem and to make recommendations to Congress. Of course, the commission was packed with Morgan's friends and cronies. The chairman was a man named Nelson Aldrich. Aldrich represented the homes of America's richest banking families. His daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., and together they had 5 sons. John, Nelson, who would become the vice president in 1974, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, the head of the Council on Foreign Relations and former chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank. As soon as the National Monetary Commission was set up, Senator Aldrich immediately embarked on a 2-year tour of Europe, where he consulted at length with the private central bankers in England, France, and Germany, and the total cost of this trip alone to taxpayers was $300,000, which was an astronomical sum in these days. Shortly after his return, on the evening of November 22, 1910, some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America boarded Senator Aldrich's private rail car in the strictest secrecy as they journeyed to Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. With the group came Paul Warburg. Warburg had been given $500,000 yearly salary to lobby for the passage of a privately owned central bank in America. Warburg's partner in this firm was a man named Jacob Schiff, the grandson of the man who shared the Green Shield house with the Rothschild family in Frankfurt. Schiff, as we find out later, was in the process of spending $20 million to finance the overthrow of the Tsar in Russia. These 3 European banking families, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, and the Schiffs, were interconnected by marriage down through the years, just as the American banking counterparts, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, and the Aldriches were. So again, like you got the Bank of England, you got the Federal Reserve, which is about to be established right here via going to Jekyll Island and using the Bank of England's model to create the Federal Reserve. And, before that we had the Second Bank of the United States. Before that, we had the Bank of the United States. It's the same thing over and over again, just more consolidated and more corrupt. Those are your families. We'll say it again. These three European banking families are the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, and the Shivs, and they're interconnected by marriage down through the years, just as their American banking counterparts, the Morgan Rockefellers and the Aldriches. It's like the last 100 years of banking royalty. Secrecy was so tight on this Jekyll Island trip with these banker families, your European and American banker families, it was so secret that all 7 primary participants were cautioned to use only first names to prevent servants from learning their identities. And years later, one participant, Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank of New York and a representative of the Rockefeller family, confirmed the Jekyll Island trip in a February 9th, 1935 edition of the Saturday Evening Post. Quote, "I was as secretive, indeed as furtive as any conspirator. Discovery, we knew, simply must not happen, or else all our time and effort would be wasted. If it were to be exposed that our particular group had gotten together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatsoever of passage by Congress." End quote, Frank Vanderlip. The participants came to Jekyll Island to figure out how to solve their major problem, how to bring back a privately owned central bank, but there were other problems that needed to be addressed as well. First of all, the market share of big national banks was shrinking fast. In the first 10 years of the century, the number of U.S. banks had more than doubled to over 20,000. By 1913, only 29% of all banks were national banks, and they held only 57% of deposits, as Senator Aldrich later admitted in a magazine article, quote, "Before the passage of this act, the New York bankers could only dominate the reserves of New York. Now we are able to dominate the bank reserves of this entire country," end quote, Senator Nelson Aldrich. Therefore, something had to be done to bring these new banks under their control. As John D. Rockefeller put it, quote, "Competition is sin," end quote. Secondly, the nation's economy was so strong that the corporations were starting to finance their expansions out of profits instead of taking out huge loans from large banks. In the first 10 years of the new century, 70% of corporate funding came from profits. In other words, American industry had become independent of the money changers, and that trend had to be stopped, according to the money changers. All these Jekyll Island participants knew that these problems could be hammered out into a workable solution, but perhaps their biggest problem was a public relations problem, the name of the bank. That discussion took place in one of the many conference rooms of the Jekyll Island Club Hotel. Aldrich believed the word bank should not even appear in the name. Warburg wanted to call the legislation the National Reserve Bill or the Federal Reserve Bill. The idea here was to give the impression that the purpose of the new central bank was to stop bank runs but also to conceal its monopoly character. However, it was Aldrich, the egotistical politician, who insisted it be called the Aldrich Bill. After 9 days at Jekyll Island, the group dispersed. The new central bank would be very similar to the old Bank of the United States. It would be given a monopoly over U.S. currency and create the money out of nothing. How does the Fed create money out of nothing? It's a 4-step process, but first let's talk about bonds, because bonds are simply a promise to pay or government IOUs. People buy bonds to get a secure rate of interest, and at the end of the term of the bond, the government repays the bond plus interest, and the bond is destroyed. Now, here's the Fed money-making process. Step 1, the Federal Open Market Committee approves the purchase of U.S. bonds. Step 2, bonds are purchased by the Fed. Step 3, the Fed pays for the bonds with electronic credits to the seller's bank. These credits are based on nothing. And then step 4, the bank uses these deposits as reserves, and they can loan out over 10 times the amount of their reserves to new borrowers, all at interest. So yeah, just making money out of nothing, times 10, all at interest. In this way, a Fed purchase of, say, $1 million worth of bonds gets turned into over $10 million in bank accounts, and the Fed, in effect, creates 10% of this totally new money, and the bank creates the other 90%. To reduce the amount of money in the economy, the process is just reversed. The Fed sells bonds to the public, and the money flows out of the purchaser's local bank. Loans must be reduced by 10 times the amount of the sale. So, for example, a sale of $1 million in bonds results in $10 million less money in the economy. So this is how they reduce the money supply. So how does this benefit the bankers who huddled to Jekyll Island? First of all, it totally misdirects banking reform and efforts from proper solutions. Second, it prevents a proper debt-free system of government finance like Lincoln's greenbacks from making a comeback. The bond-based system of government finance forced on Lincoln after he created greenbacks was now cast in stone. Third, it delegated to the bankers the right to create 90% of our money supply based on only the fractional reserves, which they had then loan out at interest. Fourth, it centralized overall control of the nation's money supply in the hands of a few men. Fifth, it established a central bank with a high degree of independence from effective political control. And soon after its creation, the Fed's Great Contraction in the early 1930s would cause the Great Depression, and the independence has been enhanced since then through additional laws. In order to fool the public into thinking the government had taken control, the plan called for the Fed to be run by a board of governors appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. But all the bankers had to do was to be sure their men got appointed to the board of governors, and that wasn't hard at all considering bankers have money and money buys influence over politicians. Once the participants left Jekyll Island, the public relations blitz was on. The big New York banks had to put together an educational fund of $5 million to finance professors at respected universities to endorse the new bank. Woodrow Wilson at Princeton, to go full circle there, was one of the first to jump on the bandwagon, and the bankers' plan actually didn't work. The Aldrich Bill was quickly identified as the Bankers' Bill, and it was considered a bill to benefit only what became known as the money trust. As Congressman Lindbergh put it during the congressional debate, quote, "The Aldrich plan is the Wall Street plan. It means another panic, if necessary, to intimidate the people. Aldrich, paid by the government to represent the people, proposes a plan for the trusts instead," end quote, Representative Charles A. Lindbergh. Seeing that they didn't have the votes to win in Congress, the Republican leadership never brought the Aldrich Bill to vote. The bankers quietly decided to move to Track 2, the Democratic alternative. They began financing Woodrow Wilson as the Democratic nominee. As respected historian James Perloff put it, Wall Street financier Bernard Baruch was put in charge of Wilson's education. Quote, "Baruch brought Wilson to the Democratic Party headquarters in New York in 1912. Leading him, one would a poodle on a string. Wilson received an indoctrination course from the leaders convened there." That's a quote by James Perloff. The money changers poised to install their privately owned central bank once again. The damage President Jackson had done 76 years earlier had been only partly repaired with the passage of the National Bank Act during the Civil War. Since then, the battle had raged on across the decades, and the Jacksonians became the greenbackers, who became the hardcore supporters of William Jennings Bryan, and Bryan leading the charge. These opponents of the money changers, ignorant of Baruch's tutelage, now threw themselves behind Democratic Woodrow Wilson, and they and Bryan would soon be betrayed. During the presidential campaign, the Democrats were careful to pretend to oppose the Aldrich Bill, as Representative Lewis McFadden, himself a Democrat, as well as the chairman of the House of Banking and Chairman Committee, explained it 20 years after the fact. Quote, "The Aldrich Bill was condemned in the platform. When Woodrow Wilson was nominated, the men who ruled the Democratic Party promised the people that if they were ever returned to power, there would be no central bank established here while they held the reins of government. 13 months later, that promise was broken, and the Wilson administration, under the tutelage of those sinister Wall Street figures who stood here behind Colonel House, established here in our free country the worm-eaten, monarchical institution of the King's Bank, to control us from the top downward and to shackle us from the cradle to the grave." End quote, Representative Lewis McFadden. Once Wilson was elected, Morgan, Warburg, Baruch, and company advanced a new plan, which Warburg named the Federal Reserve Plan. Democratic leadership hailed the new bill, called the Glass-Owen Bill, as something radically different from the Aldrich Bill, but in fact the bill was virtually identical in every important detail. In fact, so vehement were the Democratic denials of similarity that Paul Warburg, the father of both bills, had to step in to reassure his paid friends in Congress that the two bills were virtually identical. Quote, "Brushing aside the external differences affecting the shells, we find the kernels of the two systems very closely resembling and related to one another," end quote, Paul Warburg. But that admission was for private consumption only. Publicly, the money trust trotted out Senior Aldrich and Frank Vanderlip, the president of the Rockefeller's National City Bank of New York and one of the Jekyll Island Seven, to oppose the new Federal Reserve System. Years later, Vanderlip admitted in the Saturday Evening Post that the two measures were virtually identical. Quote, "Although the Aldrich Federal Reserve Plan was defeated when it bore the name Aldrich, nevertheless, its essential points were all contained in the plan that finally was adopted," end quote, Frank Vanderlip. As Congress neared the vote, they called Ohio attorney Alfred Crozier to testify. Crozier noted that the similarities between the Aldrich Bill and the Glass-Owen Bill. Quote, "The bill grants just what Wall Street and the big bankers for 25 years have been striving for, private instead of public control of currency. The Glass-Owen Bill, does this as completely as the Aldrich Bill. Both measures rob the government and the people of all effective control over the public's money and invest in the banks exclusively and dangerously the power to make money among people scarce or plenty," end quote, Alfred Crozier, Ohio attorney. During the debate on the measure, senators complained that the big banks were using their financial muscle to influence the outcome, saying, quote, "There are bankers in this country who are enemies of the public welfare," end quote. Despite the charges of deceit and corruption, the bill was finally snuck through the Senate on December 22, 1913, after most senators had left town for the holidays after being assured by the leadership that nothing would be done until long after the Christmas recess. On the day the bill was passed, Congressman Lindbergh prophetically warned his countrymen that, quote, "This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government by the monetary power will be legalized. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning will only be a few years removed. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking bill," end quote. Representative Charles Lindbergh. Give him a walk by. There you go. Show him your strut. Yep. There you go. Oh, yes. On top of all this, only weeks earlier, Congress had finally passed a bill legalizing income tax. Why was income tax important, you might ask? Because bankers finally had in place a system which would run up virtually unlimited federal debt. And how would the interest on the debt be repaid? Never mind the principal? Well, remember, a privately owned central bank creates the principal out of nothing. The federal government was small then, and until then it had subsided merely on tariffs and excise taxes. Just as the Bank of England, the interest payments had to be guaranteed by direct taxation of the people. The money changers knew that if they had to rely on contributions from the states, eventually the individual state legislatures would revolt and either refuse to pay the interest on their own money or at least bring political pressure to bear to keep the debt small. It is interesting to note that in 1895 the Supreme Court had found a similar income tax to be unconstitutional. The Supreme Court even found a corporate income tax law unconstitutional in 1909. As a result, Senator Aldrich hustled a bill for a constitutional amendment allowing income tax through the Congress. The proposed 16th Amendment of the Constitution was then sent to the state legislatures for approval, but some critics claim that the 16th Amendment was never ratified by the necessary 3/4 of the states. In other words, the 16th Amendment may not even be legal. But the money changers were in no mood to debate the fine points. By October 1913, Senator Aldrich had hustled the income tax bill through Congress, and without the power to tax the people directly and bypass the states, the Federal Reserve Bill would be far less useful to those who wanted to drive America deeply into their debt. A year after the passage of the Federal Reserve Bill, Congressman Lindbergh explained how the Fed created what we have come to call the business cycle and how did they use it to their advantage. Quote, "To cause high prices, all the Federal Reserve Board will have to do will be to lower the rediscount rate, producing an expansion of credit and a rising stock market. Then, when businessmen are adjusted to these conditions, it can check prosperity in mid-career by arbitrarily raising the rate of interest. It can cause the pendulum of a rising and falling market to swing gently back and forth by slight changes in the discount rate, or cause violent fluctuations by a greater rate variation. And in either case, it will possess inside information as to the financial conditions and advanced knowledge of the coming change, either up or down. This is the strangest, most dangerous advantage ever placed in the hands of a special privileged class by any government that has ever existed. The system is private, conducted for the sole purpose of obtaining the greatest possible profits from the use of other people's money. They know in advance when to create panics to their advantage, and they also know when to stop the panic. Inflation and deflation work equally well for them when they control finance." End quote, Representative Charles Lindbergh. Congressman Lindbergh was correct on all points, but what he didn't realize was that most of the European nations had already fallen prey to the central bankers decades or centuries earlier. But he also mentions the interesting fact that only 1 year later, the Fed had cornered the market in gold. This is how he put it. Quote, "Already the Federal Reserve banks have cornered the gold and gold certificates," end quote. But Congressman Lindbergh was not the only critic of the Fed. Congressman Lewis T. McFadden, the chairman of the House and Banking Currency Committee from 1920 to 1931, remarked that the Federal Reserve Act brought about, quote, "a superstate controlled by international bankers and international industrialists acting together to enslave the world for their own pleasure," end quote. Representative Lewis T. McFadden. Notice how McFadden saw the international character of the stockholders of the Federal Reserve. Another chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee in the 1960s put it this way, quote, "In the United States today, we have in effect two governments. We have a duly constituted government, and we have an independent, uncontrolled, and uncoordinated government and the Federal Reserve System, operating the money powers which are reserved to Congress by the Constitution," end quote. Representative Wright Paulman. Even the so-called inventor of the electric light, Thomas Edison, joined the fray in criticizing the system of the Federal Reserve. Quote, "If our nation can issue a dollar bond, it can issue a dollar bill. The element that makes the bond good makes the dollar bill good also. The difference between the bond and the bill is the bond lets money brokers collect twice the amount of the bond and an additional 20%, whereas the currency pays nobody but those who contribute directly in some useful way. It is absurd to say that our country can issue 30 million in bonds and not 30 million in currency. Both are promises to pay, but one promise fattens the usurers and the other helps the people. End quote. Thomas Edison. 3 years after the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, even President Wilson began to have second thoughts about what he had unleashed during his first term in office. Yeah, because he realized exactly who he was working for. But anyways, his quote is, "We have come to be one of the worst ruled and one of the most completely controlled governments in the civilized world. No longer a government of free opinion, no longer a government by a vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. Some of the biggest men in the United States, in the field of commerce and manufacture, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." End quote. Woodrow Wilson. Yeah, saying, better watch what I say here. We are not in control. Before his death in 1924, President Wilson realized the full extent of the damage he had done to America when he confessed, quote, "I have unwittingly ruined my government," end quote. So finally, the money changers, those who profit by manipulating the amount of money in the circulation, had their privately owned central bank installed again in America. The major newspapers, which they also owned, hailed passage of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, telling the public that now depressions could be scientifically prevented. However, the fact of the matter was that now depressions could be scientifically created. Power was now centralized to a tremendous extent. Now it was time for a war, a really big war. In fact, this would be the First World War. Of course, to the central bankers, the political issues of war don't matter nearly as much as the profit potential, and nothing creates debts like warfare. England was the best example at the time. During the 119-year period between the founding of the Bank of England and Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, England had been at war for 56 years, and much of the remaining time she had been preparing for war. In World War I, the German Rothschilds loaned money to the Germans, the British Rothschilds loaned money to the British, and the French Rothschilds loaned money to the French. In America, J.P. Morgan was the sales agent for both war materials to the British and the French, and in fact, 6 months into the war, Morgan had become the largest consumer, spending $10 million a day. His offices at 23 Wall Street were mobbed by brokers and salesmen trying to cut a deal. In fact, it got so bad that the bank had to post guards at every door and at the partners' homes as well. Many of the New York bankers made out well from the war. President Wilson appointed Bernard Baruch to head the War Industries Board. According to historian James Perloff, both Baruch and the Rockefellers profited by some $200 million during the war, but profits were not the only motive there. There was also revenge. The money changers never forgave the Russians for their support of Lincoln during the war, and also Russia was the last major European nation to refuse to give in to the privately owned central bank scheme. 3 years after World War I broke out, the Russian Revolution toppled the Tsar and installed the scourge of communism. Jacob Schiff bragged from his deathbed that he had spent $20 million towards the defeat of the Tsar. Money was funneled from England to support the revolution as well. You might ask, why would some of the richest men in the world financially back communism, the system that was so openly vowing to destroy the so-called capitalism that made them wealthy? Well, as one explained it, quote, "If one understands that socialism is not a share the wealth program, but is really a method to consolidate and control the wealth, then the seeming paradox of super rich men promoting socialism becomes no paradox at all. Instead, it becomes logical. Even the perfect tool of power-seeking megalomaniacs, communism, or more accurately socialism, is not a movement of the downtrodden masses, but of the economic elite." End quote. Gary Allen, who was an author. In another book, it was said like this: "Power from any source tends to create an appetite for additional power. It was almost inevitable that the super rich would one day aspire to control not only their own wealth, but the wealth of the entire world. To achieve this, they were perfectly willing to feed the ambitions of the power-hungry political conspirators who were committed to the overthrow of all existing governments and the establishment of a central worldwide dictatorship." End quote. W. Cleon Skousen. But what if these revolutionaries get out of control and try and seize the power from the super rich? After all, it was Mao Zedong who in 1938 stated his position concerning political power. Quote, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun." End quote. The Wall Street London Access elected to take the risk. The master planners attempted to control revolutionary communist groups by feeding them vast quantities of money when they obeyed and contracting their money supply or even financing their opposition if they got out of control. Lenin began to understand that although he was the absolute dictator of the new Soviet Union, he was not pulling the financial strings. Someone else was silently in control. Quote, "The state does not function as we desired, the car does not obey. A man is at the wheel, he seems to lead it, but the car does not drive in the desired direction. It moves as another force wishes." Quote, Vladimir Lenin. Who is behind it? Representative Louis T. McFadden, the chairman of the House of Banking and Currency Committee throughout the 1920s and into the Great Depression years of the 1930s, explained this way. Quote, "The course of Russian history has indeed been greatly affected by the operations of international bankers. The Soviet government has been given United States Treasury funds by the Federal Reserve Board acting through the Chase Bank. England has drawn money from us through the Federal Reserve banks and has relent it at higher rates of interest to the Soviet government. The Dnepr Dam was built with funds unlawfully taken from the United States Treasury by the corrupt and dishonest Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks." End quote, Louis T. McFadden. In other words, the Fed and the Bank of England, at the behest of the international bankers who controlled them, were creating a monster, one which would fuel 7 decades of unprecedented communism revolution, warfare, and most importantly, debt. In case you think there's some chance that the money changers got communism going and then lost control, in 1992, the Washington Times reported that the Russian President Boris Yeltsin was upset that most of the incoming foreign aid was being siphoned off, straight back into the coffers of Western banks in debt service. No one in their right mind would claim that a war as large as World War I had a single cause. Wars are complex things with many causing factors. But on the other hand, it would be equally foolish to ignore as a prime cause of World War I those who had profited the most from the war. The role of money changers is no wild conspiracy. They had a motive, a short-range self-serving motive as well as a long-range political motive of advancing totalitarian governments, with the money changers maintaining the financial clout to control whatever politician might emerge as the leader. Next, we will see what the money changers' ultimate political goal is for the world. Shortly after World War I, the overall political agenda of the money changers began to come clear. Now that they controlled national economies individually, the next step was the ultimate form of consolidation, world government. The New World Government proposal, or the New World Order, was a proposal given top priority at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. It was called the League of Nations, but much to the surprise of Warburg and Baruch, who attended the peace conference with President Wilson, the world was not yet ready to dissolve national boundaries. Nationalism still beat strong in the human breast. For example, the British Foreign Secretary of the time called the League of Nations a good joke, even though it was the standard policy of the British government to support it. To the humiliation of President Wilson, the U.S. Congress wouldn't ratify the deal, despite the fact that it had been ratified by many other nations. Without money flowing through the U.S. Treasury, the League died. After World War I, the American public had grown tired of the internationalist policies of Democratic Woodrow Wilson. In the presidential election of 1920, Republican Warren Harding won a landslide victory with over 60% of the vote. Harding was a foe of the League of Nations. His election, which opened a 12-year run of Republican presidents in the White House, led to an unprecedented era known as the Roaring Twenties. Despite the fact that the war had brought America a debt 10 times larger than its Civil War debt, still the American economy surged. Gold poured into the country during the war, and it continued to do so afterwards. In the early 1920s, the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a man named Benjamin Strong, met frequently with secretive and eccentric governor of the Bank of England, Montagu Norman. Norman was determined to replace the gold England had lost to the U.S. during World War I and return the Bank of England to its former position of dominance in world finance. On top of that, rich with gold, the American economy might get out of hand again, just like it had done after the Civil War. During the next 8 years, under the presidency of Harding and Coolidge, the huge federal debt built up during World War I was cut down by 38% to $16 billion, the greatest percentage drop in U.S. history. During the election of 1920, Harding and Calvin Coolidge ran against James Cox, the governor of Ohio, and the little-known Franklin D. Roosevelt, who had previously risen to no higher post than President Wilson's Assistant Secretary of Navy. After his inauguration, Harding moved quickly to formally kill the League of Nations. Then he quickly moved to reduce domestic taxes while raising tariffs to record heights. Now, this was a revenue policy by which most of the Founding Fathers would have certainly approved. His second year in office, Harding became ill, and on a train trip, he suddenly died. No autopsy was performed, and the cause was said to be either pneumonia or food poisoning. mind-numbing that he's the president of the United States and no autopsy was performed. It's the president of the United States dies and they're not looking into it. What? When Coolidge took over, he continued Harding's domestic and economic policy on high tariffs on imports while cutting income taxes, and as a result, the economy grew at such a rate that net revenue still increased. Now, according to the money changers, that had to be stopped, so just as they had done frequently before, the money changers decided it was time to crash the American economy. The Federal Reserve began flooding the country with money, increasing the money supply by 62% during these years, and money was very plentiful, hence being known as the Roaring Twenties. Before his death in 1919, former President Teddy Roosevelt warned the American people of what was going on, and as he reported in the March 27, 1922 edition of the New York Times, he said, quote, "These international bankers and Rockefeller Standard Oil interests control the majority of newspapers and the columns of these papers to club into submission or drive out of public office officials who refuse to do the bidding of powerful corrupt cliques which compromise the invisible government," end quote. Theodore Roosevelt. Just one day before, in the New York Times, the mayor of New York of the time quoted Roosevelt blasting those he saw as taking control of America, its political machinery, and the press. He said, quote, "The warning of Theodore Roosevelt has much timeliness today, for the real menace of our republic is the invisible government which like a giant octopus sprawls its slimy length over a city, state, and nation. It seizes in its long and powerful tentacles our executive officers, our legislative bodies, our schools, our courts, our newspapers, and every agency created for the public protection. To depart from mere generalizations, let me say that at the head of this octopus are the Rockefeller Standard Oil Interest and a small group of powerful banking houses generally referred to as the international bankers. The little coterie of powerful international bankers virtually run the United States government for their own selfish purposes. They practically control both parties, write political platforms, make cat's paws of party leaders, use the leading men of private organizations, and resort to every device to place in nomination for high public office only such candidates as will be amenable to the dictates of corrupt big business. These international bankers and Rockefeller Standard Oil interests control the majority of newspapers and magazines in this country," end quote. John Hyland, Mayor of New York, New York Times, March 26, 1922. Nothing new. Why didn't people listen to such strong warnings and demand the Congress to reverse its 1913 passage of the Federal Reserve Act? Because remember, it was the 1920s, and a steady increase in bank loans contributed to a rising market. In other words, just as it is today, in times of prosperity, nobody wants to worry about economic issues. But there's a dark side to all the prosperity, because businessmen expanded and became strung out on credit, speculation in a booming market became rampant. Although everything looked rosy, it was a castle made of sand, and when all was in readiness in April of 1929, Paul Warburg, the father of the Federal Reserve, sent out a secret advisory warning to his friends that a collapse and nationwide depression was certain. In August of 1929, the Fed began to tighten money. It is not a coincidence that the biographies of all the Wall Street giants, from the Rockefellers to the Morgans, Baruch, etc., all marvel that they got out of the stock market just before the crash and put their assets in cash or gold. Unreal. On October 24, 1929, the big New York bankers called in their 24-hour broker call loans, and what this means is that the brokers and customers have to dump their stocks on the market to cover their loans no matter what price they have to sell them for. As a result, the market tumbles, and that was known as Black Thursday. According to John Kenneth Galbraith, writing in The Great Crash in 1929, quote, "At the height of the selling frenzy, Bernard Baruch brought Winston Churchill into the visitors' gallery of the New York Stock Exchange here to witness the panic and impress him with his power over the wild events down on the floor," end quote. Congressman Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Committee on Banking and Currency from 1920 to 1931, knew who to blame. He accused the Fed and the international bankers of orchestrating the crash, and it was, quote, "not an accident. It was carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair here so that they might emerge as rulers of us all," end quote, Louis McFadden. But he went even further, openly accusing them of causing a crash in order to steal America's gold. In February 1931, in the midst of the Depression, he put it this way, quote, "I think it can hardly be disputed that the statesmen and financiers of Europe are ready to take almost any means to require rapidly the gold stock which Europe lost to America as a result of World War I." End quote. Curtis Dahl, a broker of Lehman Brothers, was on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange on the day of the crash. In his 1970 book titled FDR, My Exploited Father-in-Law, he explained that the crash was triggered by the planned sudden shortage of call money in the New York money market. Quote, "Actually, it was the calculated cheering of the public by the world money powers triggered by the planned sudden shortage of call money in the New York money market." End quote. Curtis Dahl, son-in-law of FDR. Within a few weeks, $3 billion of wealth simply seemed to vanish. Within a year, $40 billion had been lost. But did it really disappear, or was it simply just consolidated into fewer hands? And what did the Federal Reserve do? Instead of moving to help the economy out by quickly lowering interest rates to stimulate the economy, the Fed continued to brutally contract the money supply further, deepening the Depression. Between 1929 and 1933, the Fed reduced money supply by an additional 33%. Although most Americans have never heard that the Fed was the cause of the Depression, this is a well-known fact among top economists. Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist of Stanford University, said the same thing in a National Public Radio interview in January 1996. Quote, "The Federal Reserve definitely caused the Great Depression by contracting the amount of currency in circulation by 1/3 from 1929 to 1933. Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize-winning economist. That was his quote. Dude won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he is telling you that the Great Depression was caused over 1/3 of the money supply being retracted in 1929 to 1933. But the money lost by most Americans during the Depression didn't just vanish. It was just redistributed into the hands of those who had gotten out just before the crash and had purchased gold, which is always a safe place to put your money just before a depression. But America's money also went overseas, incredibly, as President Hoover was heroically trying to rescue banks and prop up businesses with millions of Americans starving. As the Great Depression deepened, billions of dollars were spent rebuilding Germany from damage sustained during World War I. 8 years before Hitler would invade Poland, Representative Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, warned that Congress and Americans were paying for Hitler's rise to power. Quote, "After World War I, Germany fell into the hands of the German international bankers. Those bankers bought her, and they now own her lock, stock, and barrel. They have purchased her industries. They have mortgages on her soil. They control her production. They control all her public utilities. The international German bankers have subsidized the present government of Germany, and they have also supplied every dollar of the money Adolf Hitler has used in his lavish campaign to build up a threat to the government of Brüning. When Brüning fails to obey the orders of the German international bankers, Hitler is brought forth to scare the Germans into submission. Through the Federal Reserve Board, over $30 billion of American money has been pumped into Germany. You've all heard of the spending that has taken place in Germany. Modernistic dwellings, her great planetariums, her gymnasiums, her swimming pools, her fine public highways, her perfect factories, all this was done on our money. And this was given to Germany through the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board has pumped so many billions of dollars into Germany that they dare not name the total." End quote, Representative Louis McFadden. Franklin D. Roosevelt was swept into office during the 1932 presidential election, and once Roosevelt was in office, however, emergency banking measures were immediately announced which did nothing but increase the Fed's power over the money supply. Then and only then did the Fed finally begin to loosen the purse strings and feed new money out to the starving American people. At first, Roosevelt railed against the money changers as being the cause of the Depression. Believe it or not, this is what he said on March 4, 1933, in his inaugurational address. Quote, "Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion. Rejected by the hearts and minds of men, the money changers have fled from their high seats in the temple of our civilization." End quote. Franklin D. Roosevelt, March 4, 1933. But 2 days later, Roosevelt declared a bank holiday and closed all banks. Later that year, Roosevelt outlawed private ownership of all gold bullion and gold coins, with the exception of rare coins. Most of the gold in the hands of the average American was in the form of gold coins. The new decree was in fact a confiscation. Those who didn't comply risked as much as 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, which today would be $100,000. Out in small-town America, some people didn't trust Roosevelt's order, and many were torn between keeping their hard-earned wealth or obeying the government. Those who did turn in their gold were paid the official price for it, $20.66 per ounce at the time. So unpopular was the confiscation order that no one anywhere in government would take credit for authoring it. No congressman claimed it, and at the signing ceremony, President Roosevelt made clear to all the people present that he was not the author of it and publicly stated that he did not ever read it. Even his Secretary of the Treasury said that he'd never read it either, saying, quote, "It's what the experts wanted." Roosevelt convinced the public to give up their gold by saying that pooling their nation's resources was necessary to get America out of the Depression, and with great fanfare, he ordered a new bullion depository built to hold the mountain of gold the U.S. government was illegally confiscating. By 1936, the U.S. bullion depository at Fort Knox was completed, and in January 1937, the gold began to flow into it. The rip off the ages was about to proceed, and in 1935, once the gold had all been turned in, the official price of gold was now suddenly raised to $35 per ounce, but the catch was that only foreigners could sell their gold at the new higher price. The money changers who had gotten Warburg's warning got out of the market just before the crash and bought their gold at $20.66 per ounce, then shipped it back to London, and now could bring it back and sell it to the government, nearly doubling their money, while the average American starved. The Fort Knox Bullion Depository sits in the middle of Fort Knox Military Reservation near Louisville, Kentucky. The 4-acre ground surrounding the building are guarded by an electrified steel fence, an open moat, and 4 machine-gun-armed guard boxes at the structure's corners. When the gold began arriving on January 13, 1937, there was an unprecedented security. Thousands of official guests watched the arrival of a 9-car train from Philadelphia, guarded by armed soldiers, postal inspectors, Secret Servicemen, and guards from the U.S. Mint. It was all great theater. America's gold supply had been pooled supposedly for the public benefit and then safely tucked into Fort Knox. But all that security would soon be breached by the government itself. Now the stage was set for a really big war, one that would pile up debt far beyond that of World War I. For example, in 1944 alone, the U.S. national income was only $183 billion, yet $103 billion was spent on war. This was 30 times the spending rate during World War I, and in fact, the American taxpayer picked up a 55% of the total Allied cost of the war. But equally important, virtually every nation involved in World War II greatly multiplied their debt. In fact, the U.S., for example, their federal debt went from $43 billion in 1940 up to $257 billion in 1950, an increase of 600%. Between 1940 and 1950, Japanese debt swelled 1,350%, French debt grew 583%, and Canadian debt grew 417%. After the war, the world was now divided into 2 economic camps, communist command economies on the one hand versus monopoly capitalists on the other, set to fight it out in one perpetual and highly profitable arms race. It was finally time for the central bankers to embark in their 3-step plan to centralize the economic systems of the entire world and finally bring about their global government or New World Order. The phases of this plan were: Step 1, central bank domination and national economies worldwide. Step 2, centralized regional economies through organizations like the European Monetary Union and regional trade unions like NAFTA. Step 3, centralize the world economy with the World Central Bank, a world money, and ending national independence through abolition of all tariffs by treaties like GATT. Step 1 was completed long ago. Step 2 and 3 are far advanced, nearing completion. What about gold? Well, among central bankers, the largest holder of gold is now the IMF. It and central banks now control 2/3 of the world's gold supply, giving them the ability to manipulate the gold market. Remember the money changer's golden rule: he who has the gold makes the rules. Before we get into the solutions to our problem, let's take a look at what happened with the gold at Fort Knox, because if we don't understand that the gold has been stolen, we will allow ourselves to be stampeded in the wrong direction, which is a gold-backed currency. Most Americans still believe that the gold is still at Fort Knox. At the end of World War II, Fort Knox contained over 700 million ounces of gold, an incredible 70% of all the gold in the world. How much remains? No one knows. Despite the fact that federal law requires an annual physical audit of Fort Knox gold, the Treasury has consistently refused to conduct one. The truth is that a reliable audit of whatever remains there has not been conducted since President Eisenhower ordered one in 1953. By 1971, all the pure gold had been secretly removed from Fort Knox, trained back to London. Once the gold was gone from Fort Knox, President Nixon closed the gold window by repealing Roosevelt's Gold Reserve Act of 1934. This finally made it legal once again for Americans to buy gold, and naturally gold's prices immediately began to soar. 9 years later, gold sold for $880 per ounce, 25 times what the gold in Fort Knox was sold for. One would think that eventually someone in the government would get wind of what was happening and blow the whistle. The largest fortune in the history of the world stolen, shades of the old James Bond film Goldfinger. And well, as a matter of fact, Ian Fleming, the author of the James Bond series, was the head of the British counterintelligence service MI5, and some believe in the intelligence community that he wrote much of his fiction as a warning, as many authors of fiction do. If the removal of all the good delivery gold from Fort Knox can be viewed as a deliberate raid on the U.S. Treasury, then such an operation might have been years in the making, mainly 40 years, enough time for Fleming to get wind of it and try and prevent it. So just how did the story of Fort Knox gold robbery get out? It all started with an article in the New York Periodical in 1974. The article charged the Rockefeller family with manipulating the Federal Reserve to sell off Fort Knox gold at bargain basement prices to anonymous European speculators. 3 years later, the anonymous source of the story, Louise Anchoress Boyer, mysteriously fell to her death from a window of her 10th floor apartment in New York. How was Mrs. Boyer have known of the Rockefeller connection to the Fort Knox gold heist? She was a longtime secretary of Nelson Rockefeller, and Louise was a known aide to Rockefeller, and the newspaper depicting her death even stated her as such in the headline. For the next 14 years, Ed Durrell, a wealthy Ohio industrialist, devoted himself to a quest for the truth concerning the Fort Knox gold. He wrote thousands of letters to over 1,000 government and banking officials trying to find out how much gold was really left and where the rest of it had gone. Edith Roosevelt, the granddaughter of President Teddy Roosevelt, questioned the actions of the government in a March 1975 edition of the New Hampshire Sunday News. Quote, "Allegations of missing gold from our Fort Knox vaults are being widely discussed in European financial circles. But what is puzzling is that the administration is not hastening to demonstrate conclusively that there is no cause for the concern over our gold treasure, if indeed it is in a position to do so." End quote, Edith Roosevelt. Unfortunately, Ed Durrell never did accomplish his primary goal, a full audit of the gold reserves at Fort Knox. It's incredible that the world's largest treasure has had little accounting or auditing. This gold belonged to the American people, not the Federal Reserve and their foreign owners. One thing is certain, the government could blow all of the speculation away in a few days with a well-publicized audit under the lights of media cameras. But since it has not chosen to do so, one must conclude that they are afraid of the truth such an audit would reveal. What is the government so afraid of? Here's the answer. When President Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, his conservative friends urged him to study the feasibility of returning to a gold standard as the only way to curb government spending. It sounded like a reasonable alternative, so President Reagan appointed a group of men called the Gold Commission to study the situation and report back to Congress. What Reagan's Gold Commission reported back to Congress in 1982 was the following shocking revelation concerning gold. The U.S. Treasury owned no gold at all. All the gold that was left in Fort Knox was now owned by the Federal Reserve, a group of private bankers, as collateral against the national debt. The truth of the matter is that never before has so much money been stolen from the hands of the general public and put into the hands of a small group of private investors, the money changers. In Washington, D.C., we have the headquarters of the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund. Located across the street is the headquarters of the World Bank. What are these organizations and who controls them? And most importantly, are they about to create a huge worldwide depression? Let's step back in time for a moment to the aftermath of World War I. People were tired of war, so under the guise of peacemaking, the international bankers devised a plan to consolidate power even further, claiming only international government would stem the tide of world wars. The money changers pushed forward a proposal for world government, which stood on three legs: a world central bank to be called the Bank of International Settlements, a world judiciary to be called the World Court, located in the Netherlands, and a world executive legislature to be called the League of Nations. As President Clinton's mentor, Georgetown historian Carroll Quigley wrote in his 1966 book, Tragedy and Hope, quote, "The powers of financial capitalism had a far-reaching plan, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands able to dominate the political system of each country and economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert by secret agreements arrived at in frequent meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world." End quote. Carroll Quigley, professor, Georgetown University. Despite intense pressure from the international bankers and the press, a handful of U.S. senators led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge kept the U.S. out of these schemes. Without U.S. participation, the League was doomed. Incredibly, even though the United States rejected the World Central Bank, the BIS, the New York Federal Reserve ignored its government and arrogantly sent representatives to Switzerland to participate in the central bankers' meeting right up until 1994, when the U.S. was finally officially dragged into it. Their world government scheme succeeded. The bankers resorted to the old formula: another war to wear down the resistance to world government while reaping handsome profits. To this end, Wall Street helped resurrect Germany through the Thyssen banks, which were affiliated with the Harriman interest in New York. Just as the Chase Bank had assisted in the financing of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia during World War I, Chase Bank was controlled by the Rockefeller family. Subsequently, it was merged with Warburg's Manhattan Bank to form the Chase Manhattan Bank. This has merged with Chemical Bank of New York, making it the largest Wall Street bank. Their strategy worked even before World War II was over. World government was back on track. In 1944, in New Hampshire, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were approved with full U.S. participation. The Second League of Nations, renamed the United Nations, was approved in 1945, and soon a new international court system was functioning as well. All effective opposition to these international bodies before the war had evaporated in the heat of war, just as planned. These new organizations simply repeated on a world scale what the National Banking Act of 1864 and the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 had established in the U.S. They created a banking cartel composed of world central banks, which gradually assumed the power to dictate credit policies to the banks of all nations. For example, just as the Federal Reserve Act authorized the creation of a new national fiat currency called Federal Reserve Notes, the IMF has been given authority to issue a world fiat money called Special Drawing Rights, or SDRs. Pay attention to this. I didn't even know this existed, and you can look it up, and it's just like, oh, you're a conspiracy. Dude, like, I hate that this is history and reality, but you not believing in it doesn't make it not real and not happening. It makes you willfully ignorant, and it makes them smile from ear to ear to know that you would rather not think about it. So, again, look into what's called special drawing rights, or SDRs. I know everybody knows about Federal Reserve notes and the money we have now, and you may or may not now be, well, you should be very aware now that it's printed out of nothing by bullies in suits that murder their way into the position of being able to print these notes out of nothing. But aside from the Federal Reserve notes, we now have a world currency created by the IMF, and that's the International Monetary Fund. That's your World Bank, and they have now what's called SDRs, which are special drawing rights. It's a world currency, and to date, the IMF has created in excess of $30 billion worth of SDRs, special drawing rights, and member nations are being pressured to make their currencies fully exchangeable for SDRs. So there's your one world currency right there. In 1968, Congress approved laws authorizing the Fed to accept SDRs as reserves in the U.S. and to issue Federal Reserve notes in exchange for SDRs. There you go. So what does that mean? It means that in the U.S., SDRs are already a part of our lawful money. And what about gold? SDRs are already partially backed by gold. And with 2/3 of the world gold now in the hands of central banks, the money changers can go about structuring the world economic future in whichever way they deem most profitable. And they will, and they are. And let's get some reform. That is the solution. We're about to get there. The solution is reform. You can't be mad at your quarterback. You need a new coach. So, anyways, the new coach is the new system, the reform, a banking reform. But keep in mind, just as the Fed is controlled by its board of governors, the IMF is controlled by its board of governors, which are either the heads of the different central banks or the heads of the various national treasury departments dominated by their central banks. Voting power in the IMF gives the US and the UK, that is to say the Fed and the Bank of England, effective control. Just as the Fed controls the amount of money in the US, the BIS, the IMF, and the World Bank control the money supply for the world. So is this organization of the BIS, the IMF, and the World Bank, which we refer to collectively as the World Central Bank, presently expanding and contracting world credit? Yes. Regulations put into effect in 1988 by the BIS require the world's bankers to raise their capital reserves to 8% of liabilities by 1992. Read that one more time. Regulations put into effect in 1988 by the BIS require the world bankers to raise their capital reserves to 8% of liabilities by 1992. increase capital requirements, put an upper limit to the Federal Reserve lending, similar to the way cash reserve requirements do. What does this seemingly insignificant regulation made in a Swiss city mean for the world? It means our banks cannot loan more and more money to buy more and more time before the next depression, as a maximum loan ratio is now set. That means those nations with the lowest bank reserves in their systems have already felt the terrible effects of this credit contraction as their banks scrambled to raise money to increase their reserves to 8%. To raise the money, they had to sell stocks, which depressed their stock markets and began the depression first in their countries. Japan, which in 1988 had among the lowest capital and reserve requirements and thus was the most affected by the regulation, had experienced a financial crash which began almost immediately in 1989, which has wiped out a staggering 50% of the value of its stock market since 1990 and 60% of the value of its commercial real estate. The Bank of Japan has lowered its interest rates to half of 1%, practically giving away money to resurrect the economy, but still depression worsens. Due to the $20 billion U.S. bailout of Mexico, the financial collapse in that nation is already known here. Yet despite the bailout, the economy continues to be a disaster. One huge debt after another is rolled out over as new loans are being made simply to enable Mexico to pay the interest on old loans. In the south of Mexico, the poor have been in open revolt as every spare peso is being siphoned out of the country to make interest payments. It is important to note that a radical transfer of power is taking place as nations become subservient to a supranational world central bank controlled by a handful of the world's richest bankers. As the IMF creates more and more SDRs by the stroke of a pen on IMF ledgers, more and more nations borrow them to pay interest on their mounting debt and gradually fall under the control of the faceless bureaucrats of the World Central Bank. As the worldwide depression worsens and spreads, this will give the World Central Bank the power of economic life and death over these nations. It will decide which nations are permitted to receive further loans and which nations will starve. Despite all the rhetoric about development of the alleviation of poverty, the result is a steady transfer of wealth from the debtor nations to the money changers and central banks which control the IMF and the World Bank. For example, in 1992, the third world debtor nations, which borrowed from the World Bank, paid $198 million more to the banks of the developed nations for World Bank funded purposes than they received from the World Bank. All this increases their permanent debt in exchange for temporary relief of poverty caused by prior borrowings. For example, in 1992, the third world debtor nations which borrowed from the World Bank paid $198 million more to the central banks of the developed nations for World Bank funded purposes than they received from the bank, and all this still increases their permanent debt in exchange for temporary relief of poverty caused by prior borrowings. Already these repayments exceed the amount of the new loans, and by 1992 Africa's debt had reached $290 billion, 2.5 times greater than it had been in 1980. Resulting in skyrocketing infant mortality rates and unemployment, deterioration of schools, housing, and the general health of the people. So in case you're like, so why do I, if you're still listening, you're like, but why do I care? Because while the average American starved, while people in Africa have skyrocketing infant mortality rates and unemployment and deterioration of schools and housing and general health of the people, makes me want to cry right here. It's like, while all that's happening, it's at the hand of, like, that tremendous low is at the hand of the tremendous high of that, like, oh, well, that's what maximizes profit for us being this unimaginably small group of plutocrats, like maniacs. Just scary. It's gross. Like, that anyone thinks like that, but they do, and they're not going to give up easy. So inform yourself and fight for what's right. The entire world faces the immeasurable suffering already destroying the third world, and now Japan, all for the benefit of the money changers. As one prominent Brazilian politician put it, quote, "The Third World War has already started. It is a silent war, not for that reason any less sinister. The war is tearing down Brazil, Latin America, and practically all the third world. Instead of soldiers dying, there are children. It is a war over the third world debt, one which has at its main weapon interest, a weapon more deadly than the atom bomb, more shattering than a laser beam. Although it would be absurd to ignore the pivotal role played by influential families such as the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Shivs, the Morgans, and the Rockefellers, in any review of history of central banking and fractional banking, keep in mind by now that central banks and the large commercial banks are 3 centuries old and deeply entrenched in the economic life of many nations. These banks are no longer dependent on clever individuals such as a Nathan Rothschild. Years ago, the question of ownership was important, but no longer. For example, both the Bank of England and the Bank of France were nationalized after World War II, and nothing changed, nothing at all. They continue to grow, now protected by numerous laws, paid politicians, and media, untouched by the changing of generations. 3 centuries have given them an aura of respectability. The old school tie is now worn by 6th-generation son who has been raised in a system that he may very well never question, as he is now named to serve on the governing boards of countless philanthropic organizations. To focus attention today on individuals or families, or to attempt to sort out the current holders of power, serves little purpose and would be a distraction from the cure. The problem is far bigger than that. It is the corrupt banking system that was and is being used to consolidate vast wealth into fewer and fewer hands. That is our current economic problem, changing the names of the main players now, and the problem will neither go away nor even miss a beat. Likewise, among the hordes of bureaucrats working in the World Bank, central banks, and international banks, only a tiny fraction have an idea of what's really going on. No doubt they'd be horrified to learn that their work is contributing to a terrible impoverishment and gradual enslavement of mankind to a few incredibly rich plutocrats. So really there's no use in emphasizing the role of individuals anymore, and the problem even transcends the normal spectrum of political left and right. Both communism and socialism, as well as monopoly capitalism, have been used by the money changers, and today they profit from either side of the political spectrum. The big government welfare state on the so-called left wing versus the neoconservative capitalists who want big government totally out of their lives on the right wing. Either way, the bankers win. Monetary reform is the most important political issue facing this nation. That clarified, let's proceed to the conclusion in the spirit declared by Abraham Lincoln. With malice towards no one, with charity towards all. Since 1864, we've had a debt-based banking system. All our money is based on government debt. We cannot eliminate the government debt without eliminating our money supply. That's why talk of paying off our national debt without reforming our banking system is an impossibility. That's all I got for you guys. I hope you learned something. I'm sorry this topic was so long and so mind-numbing. Bear with me on my inflection and keeping it fun and exciting. This is not a fun and exciting topic at all, and I can assure you I did this one first for that reason. If you get through this episode, I'm sure all the other ones will be a lot more exciting, a lot shorter, and a lot more fun, because this one is just reminding you how much of a slave you are and how there's pretty much nothing you can do about it except for be educated and not willingly advocate for your own bondage, even though people have stood up to these guys and they've just killed them or done it anyway. Wait till the Senate leaves, sneak it through. That's how the devil works, man. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the episode. We'll get back to you as soon as we can with another topic. Like I said, it'll be a lot lighter and shorter in the future. And you guys have a good one. Thanks so much for your support. We'll see you next time.